When the wraith in front of him was gone, Emlyn White retracted his gaze, untied the thread on the dossier, and pulled out the documents inside. As he read through them, Emlyn had a rough idea of Ernst Boyar's routine. This sanguine viscount had a routine which was rather random, staying at home, out visiting exhibitions, partaking in wine tasting at manors in the city outskirts, shopping at department stores with female companions, or sketching female models. He was like the typical wealthy man. However, Ernst had recently been visiting St. George Borough every other day to monitor the renovations of the furniture factory he had invested in. It was a bid to ensure that it could quickly resume work. This way, the sanguine viscount's lifestyle became repetitive. The places he visited, the paths he took, and the places he had lunch were repeated every other day. Emlyn pressed down on his temples, seriously filtering out 3 venues which were suitable for the operation. The first was inside or at the entrance of the furniture factory owned by Ernst Boyar. The second was St. Highland Square, where he stopped along the way home for a meal and to feed birds. The third place was Backland Bridge. Unless Ernst was willing to take a huge detour, he had to pass by this area when traveling between his home and St. George Borough. These 3 spots meet the requirement of having plenty of people, making it chaotic. However, Backland Bridge has too few entrances and exits. With the 2 ends locked down, one can only leave by jumping into the river, an act only chosen by idiots. St. Highland Square comes under St. Highland Cathedral, core to the Church of Steam in Backland, and even the entirety of Loan. It's akin to the Second Holy See. It meets Mr. Hanged Man's suggestion. It can effectively prevent conflicts from escalating, and it can interfere with any subsequent divination and investigations. Emlyn gradually had an inclination. And once a living being had an inclination, they would unknowingly seek more reasons to affirm their choice, and Emlyn was no exception, without a doubt. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that St. Highland Square met almost all the requirements. First, Ernst wouldn't stay in the area for too long. He would have lunch at a restaurant with Sivelaus cuisine since he was born in Sivelaus County. Secondly, there were several tracked carriage stops in the vicinity, making the area filled with traffic on foot. With most of them being people from the lower or middle class, accidents often happened. Thirdly, with it as the origin, one would enter the area south of the bridge if one didn't head to the Backland Bridge. It would then be Closeby to the Harvest Church. Finally, at noon, the St. Highland Cathedral would spew steam, turn its levers, and chime a clock. It was inevitable for everyone's attention to be attracted. It's confirmed. Emlyn quickly made up his mind. Raising his right hand and adjusting his bow tie, his red eyes were filled with anticipation. At this moment, he suddenly frowned, sensing that something wasn't right. St. Highland Square was just perfect for the job. It was so suitable that almost all the conditions were met. Will Ernst be wary against my revenge? Why would he allow himself to stay in such an environment for such long periods of time? Even if he's stupid enough to not realize it, wouldn't the Earls warn him? The corners of Emlyn's mouth curled up slightly as he understood the reason. St. Highland Square was the venue the sanguine upper echelons had designated for him. Hey, Emlyn chuckled, keeping his mouth curled. He decided to request Mr. Fool to have a gathering for the few members and also invite Mr. Hanged Man to discuss the plan in detail. This was different from the framework that they had previously decided upon. They needed to consider every detail and consider every problem. At 15 minutes to 12, St. George Borough, St. Highland Square. In a private room on the 3rd story of a restaurant northwest of the square. A figure stood in front of the window, holding a cup filled with scarlet blood-like liquid. He was leisurely looking at the fountain nearby and the crowds that came and went. He was a lanky person, wearing a formal suit meant for banquets. His light-colored hair that was nearly silver and his bright red eyes combined together to give him a sense of coquettish handsomeness. There was a constant faint smile lining his lips. My lord, will it really be fine? Emlyn seems to be different from before. This can be seen from his recent hunt of the primordial moon believers. A middle-aged man in a dark suit walked to the window and said with some hint of worry. The man who had been politely addressed cast his gaze at the square where Emlyn White stood. He was listening to a violinist busking on the street as he chuckled. Our preparations are enough even against a demigod, much less a kid who hasn't even become a viscount. Besides, we don't really plan on doing anything serious. Our only goal is to identify and make confirmations. This is a lot simpler than preventing certain people from escaping. As he spoke, the man with the light hair and bright red eyes raised his right hand slightly, rotating the ring on his left ring finger. The ring was made of silver, and embedded in it was a strange gem with a ghostly blue hue. On a carriage driving towards St. Hyland Square, Ernst Boyar had his right hand over his left. He naturally rotated the ring on his ring finger that had a ghostly blue gem embedded in it. He casually looked out the window and saw a trackless carriage slowly drive over from afar. A paperboy slightly taller than 160 centimeters had a sling bag across his chest as he peddled his papers along the street. Quite a number of bicycles had replaced the carriages that were often seen last year. They darted through the crowds in St. George Borough. Here, the number of workers wearing light blue or grayish-blue uniforms with hats had far exceeded the number of people in formal suits and top hats. Ernst retracted his gaze as he chuckled. He had no fear about what would happen next. He even looked forward to it. He believed that he had made enough preparations. He wore Oath of Rose on his left hand. It allowed him to share what he saw, heard, and smelled with Earl Mistral from a distance away. It made sure that nothing would go wrong while ensuring that their objective was met. In his inner pocket where his silver pocket watch was, there was a moon paper figurine. These could suffer a single lethal blow or an attack that targeted his soul body. It ensured that he wouldn't suffer any serious injuries or death within a short span of time. He also wore Alcohol Nemesis, a diamond brooch. It kept him brimming with energy with lucidity in his thoughts. It raised his resistance against spells that acted on the body of heart and mind. By his waist was a belt named Moonlight Sash. It could effectively reduce sun and lightning damage. These mystical items were the accumulation of Ernst's wealth or were bestowed by Earl Mistral. It made sure that Ernst was a target that could hardly be quickly finished off or controlled. With the Sanguine Viscount's natural resistance against nightmare-type influences, Ernst was nearly without weakness. Even against a demigod, he could put up a fight as long as the latter didn't reveal their mythical creature form. The only problem is that the negative effects of all these mystical items are quite excessive. Ernst's facial muscles twitched, but he quickly composed himself. The Oath of Rose would make his thoughts appear in Earl Mistral's mind from time to time. And if he kept wearing it for a week without removing it, the pair who had the matching rings might very well end up in love, regardless of gender or race. Moon paper figurine was an expendable item. It had nearly zero side effects apart from making the body slightly cold. The Alcohol Nemesis brooch's problem was that it would deal continuous damage to one's liver and brain. If it was worn for excessively long periods of time, it might result in one losing one's thoughts and logical reasoning. Therefore, one had to take it off for 15 minutes after every half an hour of equipping it. Once Moonlight Sash was worn, it made all senses much sharper, making it easy for one to see and hear things one shouldn't see or hear. At the same time, the wearer would feel itchy at intermittent intervals. Let's hope they don't cower in fear and that this doesn't drag on. Ernst Boyar checked on his condition once again, casting his gaze of anticipation at the St. Hyland Square's entrance nearby. On the other end of St. Hyland Square, Emlyn White, who was taking in the sights of the buskers on the streets, suddenly looked up at a bird that flew over. Following that, he raised his hand to press down on his top hat. Bowing his head slightly, he briskly walked to the middle of the square, approaching the fountain. In this process, Emlyn's figure kept moving as he mixed into the crowd. However, this failed to avoid Earl Mistral's tracking. This sanguine Earl with silver hair rotated the ghostly blue gem ring on his left ring finger and coldly said, "Take note." At the entrance of St. Hyland Square, Ernst Boyar grew increasingly pumped. He knew that the operation was about to come finally. Emlyn still chose St. Hyland Square after all. Ernst cast his gaze out the window once more, warily watching the pedestrians on the street, the trackless public carriages that were about to pass him, the ordinary paperboy who was peddling his papers, and the elegant windows of the surrounding houses and shops. He didn't believe that Emlyn's potential partners were hiding in there, because there were even more, better spots in St. Hyland Square that made it conducive to take action. However, he still kept up the required level of wariness. Suddenly, his body lunged forward slightly as he nearly got out of his seat. The carriage he was on had stopped without any warning. Right on the heels of that, the horses that pulled the carriage seemed to be in a nightmare as they raised their front hooves, struggling wildly, flipping the carriage to the ground. During this process, Ernst Boyar actually had ample space, time, and strength to help the carriage driver control the berserk horse. However, he didn't do so, because he saw a transparent wolf-shaped spectre jump over from outside the window. It had thrown a rose within its body. A rose. Ernst Boyar's eyes widened as the carriage toppled. He hurriedly jumped to the side and out the carriage as he made an illusory and incorporeal black chain extend out of the void. It wrapped around the wolf-shaped spectre. With a soft puff, the wolf-shaped spectre dissipated without a struggle. And when Ernst Boyar found his footing, he stood there motionless, his eyes turbid. He had already been pulled into a deep sleep. In a trackless public carriage that passed him by, a black-haired, green-eyed young man wore a thin trench coat. His back was facing the middle of the street as he focused on reading a notebook with a green bronze hardcover. Around him, the other passengers were either reading the papers or chatting. Some were looking out only to see the berserk horse quickly recover. With a whoosh, the black-haired, green-eyed man flipped the page of the notebook. The trackless carriage continued forward and gradually distanced itself. St. Hyland Square, in the northwestern corner, at the third story of a restaurant. When the wolf spectre with the rose appeared in front of Ernst Boyar, the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed minstrel retracted his gaze from Ernst Boyar. Darkness suffused from behind him as countless tiny bats flew within. Bribe. Just as this sanguine earl silently muttered this single word, he saw the toppled carriage, heard the neighing of the horse, and smelled all kinds of smells. However, he wasn't able to instantly find the origin of the disturbance and accident. At this moment, his vision darkened as his eyes seemed to lose the ability to take in light. The din in his ears also halted. Earl Mistral chortled inwardly as he immediately fused with the bats behind him, rematerializing beside Ernst Boyar. Suddenly, in his black vision, a point of light appeared. This point of light rapidly expanded as it grew brighter and brighter. A golden figure with 12 pairs of pitch-black wings walked out of it. The pairs of wings spread out, blanketing Mistral's vision, causing light and darkness to mix. This created mysterious and complicated symbols that didn't differentiate themselves within the golden figure. It was both holy and corrupted, both light and dark. Angel. Mistral's pupils widened slightly as he couldn't help but take a step back, terminating his previous thoughts. In confusion, Ernst Boyar rapidly snapped awake when he saw a pair of limpid eyes that resembled crystalline gems or a lake. He felt a copy of the newspapers being stuffed into his hand. In those emerald green eyes were ripples. Deep within the emanating ripples were twirls of a vortex that seemed to suck in the soul of anyone who lay their eyes on them. Ernst Boyar instantly became engrossed in it as he couldn't move his eyes away. Then, he heard a gentle and ethereal female voice in his ears, "Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White. Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White." This voice was layered as it resounded within Ernst Boyar's ears. It drilled into his brain, sinking deep into his heart. Ernst Boyar nodded in a daze, sensing that there was more, but he couldn't hear it clearly. The paperboy with a sling bag diagonally across his shoulders swiftly turned around and agilely passed through the bicycles, mixing into the crowd that came and went. This boy had a pretty face as his messy hair drooped down and hid his brows. As he walked, he took off a black fishnet glove that he had worn at some point in time, stuffing it into his sling bag filled with newspapers. As the wind blew, his clothes shrank as a spot on his exposed arm protruded out. A few seconds later, Ernst Boyar suddenly jumped back from where he stood, doing so as though he had been trying to dodge something. No good. I was influenced by a nightmare's ability. Just as he found his footing, his pupils dilated as he looked around his surroundings in a state of high alert, prepared for any impending attacks. Although Ernst Boyar was perplexed about how easily he was pulled into a dream, he knew that it wasn't time to consider the details. What followed next was key. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Ring. A few bicycles passed him as they used their bells to warn the gentleman in the middle of the road to make way. Ernst Boyar narrowed his eyes as he glared at him, his muscles under his clothes ready to deliver their might. I.e., these few bicycles circled around him as the pedestrians came and went, some slowing down their footsteps and pointing their fingers. Gong, gong, gong. 12 gongs were heard as the white steam spewed out from the chimneys of St. Hyland Cathedral. The holy hymns of praise resounded as the gears and levers got to work. On the square, everyone stopped in their footsteps. At that holy moment, they either closed their eyes in prayer or were listening silently, regardless of whether they were believers of the god of steam and machinery or not. Only the pigeons that were being fed flew up and soared into the sky. Gong gong, gong. As the gongs sounded, no one moved. Even Earl Mistral, who was inside a private room at the restaurant, stood there motionless with a heavy expression. His vision had already recovered, but all he saw was workers wearing grayish-blue or light blue clothes and bicycles of the same make. Apart from that, he discovered nothing. Furthermore, Ernst Boyar hadn't been injured at all. Of course, he had guessed that the paperboy was problematic from the newspaper in the Sanguine Viscount's hand. However, he didn't attempt to carry out a pursuit. Clearly, the power that had borrowed the level of an angel didn't belong to a low or mid-sequence beyonder. This also meant that Emlyn White's faction had at least a demigod hidden in the vicinity. Mistral believed that once he took action, he was bound to be stopped or even incur retaliation. In a situation of being easily detected while not knowing where his opponents were hiding, Mistral believed that it spelled trouble. Carrying out a pursuit in such cases only exacerbated the matter. Furthermore, to the Sanguine, this was only a test. If the faction backing Emlyn had mobilized a demigod, they could detain that powerhouse thanks to Ernst Boyar's protective measures. And through Oath of Rose, Mistral could confirm the attacker's identity. They had never thought of escalating the matter into an intense conflict. In their plans, it only involved Earl Mistral stopping the other party to prevent Ernst Boyar from suffering any harm. In the present situation, they had lost the initiative. To forcefully carry out a pursuit might highly likely result in a demigod's battle. And in Backland, around St. Hyland Cathedral, this was equivalent to suicide. Besides, to Mistral, since the other demigod hadn't personally taken action and had only provided auxiliary help, to personally take action and make a pursuit would be a loss of decorum and an insult to his reputation as a Sanguine Earl. Humph. I want to see what happens next. Mistral's facial muscles twitched as he rotated the ghostly blue ring on his left hand once more. After the 12 gongs, Emlyn started walking again. He circled past the fountain and arrived at the other end of St. Hyland Square amidst the landing pigeons. He then saw Ernst Boyar, who had his back hunched slightly, afraid to even move half a step. He saw the toppled carriage, the horse that was flicking its tail, and the carriage driver who wore a look of pain. Emlyn walked over, took out a wallet, and pulled out £100. He handed it to the carriage driver and said, "This is your compensation." Ah. The carriage driver wore a blank but pleasantly surprised look. The rental carriage wasn't his. He was only an ordinary employee. After the carriage was damaged because of the horse being startled, he experienced a brief moment of feeling the pinch. Following that, it was anxiousness and despair that ruled over his mind. Based on the so-called contract and other similar accidents he had seen over the years, he was responsible for all of this. This meant compensation from him and, with his income and family situation, meant bankruptcy. During that short moment, all kinds of thoughts had surfaced in the carriage driver's mind. They were mainly of three types. One was to scare the frozen gentleman and get him to pay compensation. This prevented his family from falling apart, with his children having to slave away at the factories at a young age. Another option was to immediately bring the horse to a gangster and sell it. Then, he would return home and leave Backland with his wife and children. The last option was to arrange for his family to move from the place they rented. He would then plead with the owner of the carriage, hoping that he could repay it in installments. If the person wasn't agreeable, he would rather be thrown into jail than reimburse him a single penny. Now, having £100 suddenly hit him left his mind groggy. He was at a loss for words. £100 was enough to buy a brand new rental carriage and even more. Emlyn ignored the carriage driver and looked at Ernst. "Everything's fine now. Aren't you the biggest problem? How can it be fine with you here?" Ernst lampooned as he rotated the ring with the ghostly blue gem on his left hand. For some unknown reason, he felt that he should believe Emlyn White and even approach him. Emlyn shot a glance, suddenly turned around, and walked briskly into an alley. Ernst subconsciously opened up his stride and followed closely behind. He kept holding onto the newspaper in hand. The two Sanguine moved at extremely fast speeds, with one running and the other chasing. However, they didn't dare reveal anything extraordinary. When Earl Mistral sensed that the two Sanguine were beyond the reach of his spirituality, he used the connection between the paired Oath of Rose rings to follow behind unhurriedly. Emlyn occasionally made detours, taking shortcuts and occasionally returning to spots they had been before. It made it difficult to guess where his destination was. As for Ernst, he was like a bull having seen a red cloth. He refused to give up as he followed closely behind. Unknowingly, the two Sanguine arrived at Rose Street, which was south of the bridge. At this moment, Emlyn suddenly sped up. He wasn't afraid that others saw him producing after images as he dashed right into the Harvest Church. Ernst did the same. Not good. From afar, Earl Mistral was just about to descend upon him to stop the subsequent developments when Ernst's figure vanished inside the Harvest Church's entrance. Catcher. A tile at Mistral's foot instantly shattered. After entering the cathedral, Ernst came to a realization. He then saw a figure wearing a brown priest robe stand up at the front of all the rows of pews. He appeared like a mountain. At the same time, the entire cathedral turned heavy as if it was a jail. It seemed to fuse with the land itself. Ernst's mind buzzed immediately as another voice sounded in his mind. After you awaken from the first hypnosis, throw all the items on you to Emlyn White. Amidst shuffling sounds, Ernst took off his sash, threw out the brooch, and slammed the various items towards Emlyn White. This included his silver pocket watch and a wallet filled with cash. Ha! The newspaper in his hand fell to the ground, throwing out a paper card that was stuffed within. On the paper card was the goddess of justice sitting on a chair and holding a sword and scale. It was the tarot card, Justice. After throwing everything other than his clothes, Ernst Boyar was stunned for a moment before he snapped to his senses. What am I doing? What did I do? This sanguine viscount finally recalled the matters he had deliberately forgotten, those pair of emerald green, limpid eyes. A psychological cue, no, hypnosis. Ernst Boyar looked around in anger and irresistible horror, instinctively taking in the situation he was in. His gaze then landed on the mountain-like figure. He saw Father Utreski with his thin and sparse brows. Instantly, Ernst Boyar had all sorts of thoughts run through his mind and collide with one another. He quickly came up with one intense thought. He didn't put up any resistance, and he immediately said, I'll come here to do a month of volunteer work. Emlyn's predicament had long been spread amongst the sanguine in Backland. Ernst Boyar was well aware of Father Utreski and knew that, even if he were to put up a fight, it was difficult for him to escape the fate of doing volunteer work. He might as well surrender and choose conditions that were more beneficial to him. At the very least, I shouldn't have any cues planted in my mind and end up converting my faith to Earth Mother. This thought flashed through Ernst's mind. He discovered a lantern in Utreski's hand, and inside it was a strange candle that seemed to be covered in human skin with protruding lumps. Under the candlelight's faint illumination, Ernst's pupils widened again. He only had one thought on his mind remaining as it kept resonating, another psychological cue. At that moment, he felt the gloominess thicken in his heart. All right, Utreski nodded and agreed to Ernst Boyar's request. Emlyn held back his smugness and pleased smile. He then looked at the items he had caught, looking like a farmer who had just reaped a bountiful harvest. In a private room on the third story of a restaurant northwest of the square, the lights darkened as a huge shadow appeared. Tiny bats flew out of the darkness and quickly clumped together. Smoke rose up as the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed Earl Mistral appeared at the spot where the bats had appeared. Everything around him had been restored to normal. His servant, a middle-aged man in a dark formal suit, immediately stepped forward and asked with a bow, "My lord, are you having your meal now?" He couldn't tell if things had happened smoothly, or if something had gone wrong, much less about the success of the outcome from the Earl's face. However, he didn't dare inquire. Mistral nodded and said, yes. He walked to the table with a composed look, took off the ring with the ghostly blue gem, and sat down without showing a chink in his disposition. It was as though he had headed out to feed the pigeons. This rich smell is rather unique, but it's not bad. In the private room neighboring Earl Mistral, Klein was wearing a very ordinary face as he commented on the Civelhouse cuisine delicacy, lamb tripe. This punishment operation was an attempt by the few members of the Tarot Club, one that didn't need the world or Mr. Fool's interference, but considering how Miss Justice and the Moon Emlyn had zero experience in such matters and lacked experience in other matters, he had come to the area incognito as a final safeguard. He had previously used his marionette to pray to the Fool while he entered the attached bathroom of his private room to head above the grey fog. Using the corresponding point of light, he had taken in the entire square and its surroundings. He kept holding the sea god scepter the entire time, prepared to deliver a lightning strike to prevent any problems once he discovered anything amiss. However, he ultimately didn't do a thing. Everything happened more smoothly than he imagined. There was no need for him to consider the experience the star Leonard, but Miss Justice, who was participating in such matters for the first time, had exceeded his expectations. She wasn't nervous at all, not showing any signs of panic. Indeed, a sequence 6 of the spectator pathway is far greater than low and mid-sequence beyonders of the other pathways when it comes to controlling emotions. Even if she felt uneasy, she would have resolved it with her beyonder powers before the operation. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he continued sampling the other delicacies. Outside the window, on St. Hyland Square, it became filled with lively music, an eclectic mix of the flute, violin, accordion, and seven-string guitar. A rental carriage was slowly circling around the perimeter of St. Hyland Square. Leonard Mitchell, who was prepared to return to the north bank of the Backland Bridge, took one look at the pigeons in the middle of the square before asking with a suppressed voice, "Old man, what's your take regarding the outcome of this operation?" After he pulled Ernst Boyar into a dream, he flipped Leymano's Travels and activated Angel's Embrace. He then left the scene on carriage, unsure of the subsequent developments. In his mind, Palais Zoroast snapped back, "In the fourth epoch, there's such a saying, believe in the might of deities. This means that this matter has received the tacit approval of Mr. Fool, so it's bound to succeed. However, old man doesn't know much about the Tarot Club. Mr. Fool is a witness most of the time, so there's no so-called tacit approval." Leonard mumbled inwardly before diverting the topic. Why doesn't this saying feel complete? He had never informed Palais Zoroast of the exact situation of the Tarot Club. All he did was give mention of the general situation of the Tarot Club and inform him of the matters that had been approved by Mr. Fool. Palais chuckled and said, "Indeed. There's also a second half of the saying, do not trust the benevolence. Believe in the might of deities, but do not trust the benevolence." Leonard repeated in silence as he looked down at the notebook with a bronze hardcover. He then muttered wistfully, "This is really akin to a Grade 1 sealed artifact. Furthermore, resolving its negative effects is relatively simple. Before this operation, consideration was given to the fact that Beyonders of the pathway involving the Moon domain, as well as the darkness, had relatively stronger resistance against nightmare-related effects." Leonard had originally planned on borrowing Creeping Hunger from the world Klein Moretti. However, after some subsequent discussion, Miss Magician mentioned the traits of Leymano's Travels, giving him a better option. Hence, Klein, who was originally responsible for Angel's Embrace, lent him Creeping Hunger for 3 hours. Various useful Beyonder powers were recorded, such as Bribe, Weaken. "This is something from the Abraham family," Palais Zoroast said with a sigh. Leonard had long known of this as he nodded indiscernibly. He then asked, "Old man, do you have the means of weakening or controlling the negative effects of the mystical item I previously mentioned?" "You call that a mystical item? That's something that requires sealing." Palais first reprimanded Leonard. Then, he said, "Didn't you say that it has a living characteristic? That makes it much easier to resolve." Leonard felt relieved as he cast his gaze out the window again, taking in the site of St. Hyland Cathedral, which had parts resembling factories. In Phelps Street, Northborough, in the vicinity of St. Samuel Cathedral, at the entrance of the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation. After changing her clothes, Audrey got off a carriage like an ordinary girl. She had already gotten rid of her paperboy attire at a hotel room that had been prepared ahead of time. And that room was reserved by someone under Emlyn's instructions. It had nothing to do with her. At this moment, there were people coming and going at the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation's entrance, but Audrey walked over without any hesitation. No one looked at her, as though she lived in another world. Audrey briskly walked into the foyer, went up to the second story, and headed for the director's office. And everyone who she walked past seemed to join her in playing a game, pretending as though they hadn't seen her. They weren't puzzled about why this unfamiliar girl was inside. Audrey was just about to enter the office when she suddenly heard a familiar voice inside. "Miss Audrey, this is the amount of donations we have gathered this week." Audrey couldn't help but curl the ends of her lips as she gently nudged the ajar door and walked in. Inside the office, a staff member was holding a stack of documents, showing it to the person behind the desk. Sitting behind the desk was a golden retriever with a pair of gold-rimmed glasses hanging by her neck. It sat at the director's seat, casually flipping through the documents, and said, "That wouldn't be an issue." The staff member then took back the document and smiled at the golden retriever. "Then, I'll take my leave, Miss Audrey." Behind her, Audrey held back her laughter as she walked to the sofa. She silently watched the staff member leave without interrupting the golden retriever from reading the other documents. Susie seriously read the different documents, afraid that something wrong would happen to her acting, thus, affecting Audrey's matters. After a while, she suddenly looked around in puzzlement. "Audrey, are you back? How did you notice?" Audrey stood up from the sofa and appeared within Susie's sights. For this operation, she had specially spoken to Susie. She got the latter to replace her at work in the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation. Then, with the golden retriever in tow, she hypnotized all the staff members who would interact with her that day, making them treat Susie as Audrey. As for any possible visitors, she told her staff that there would only be guests in the afternoon. And the signal to snap out of the hypnosis was the cathedral bells at 2 in the afternoon. Susie jumped off the chair after seeing Audrey, saying in exasperation, "It's almost 2. That's right." Audrey inwardly made a silly face as she rushed into the small lounge and changed into her clothes. She then used Lai's flame-controlling powers to bum her previous disguise. After returning to her office and sitting at her seat, she felt completely relaxed. She clasped her hands together and lightly pursed her lips. To be frank, she had always been nervous. However, she had successfully cast Placate on herself before the operation, preventing any slip-ups. It's quite interesting now that I reminisce over it. We even discussed how we would compensate those who were affected. Audrey, well done. A smile beamed on the blonde, green-eyed beauty as it grew brighter. After this operation, she realized that her hypnotist potion had digested by a significant amount. Furthermore, she had also confirmed one thing: the mystical item, Hand of Horror, which came with bribe, charm worked perfectly with hypnosis. Yes, I also learned that Mr. Moon's name is Emlyn White. He didn't bother hiding the matter, because he had to tell me. Otherwise, we wouldn't have achieved our goals. Yes. Perhaps just giving the name of the cathedral was enough, but that will still expose his identity. I'm still feeling some anxiety. I was too stiff when hypnotizing. I actually used words that were too direct during the first level of hypnosis. Audrey cast Placate on her slightly agitated feelings as she reviewed the entire operation, hoping that she could draw from the experience and lessons of today. Gong, gong. St. Samuel Cathedral's bells chimed, indicating that it was 2 in the afternoon. Many staff who were inside 22 Phelps Street at the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation had their bodies tremble after hearing it. Following that, they continued with their work as though nothing had happened. Gong, gong. Amidst the cathedral's bells, Klein, who had transformed back into Dwayne Dantes, once again walked to 160 Bockland Street's balcony and took in the situation of Mac's house. At this moment, a carriage passed by his residence's entrance and drove to the end of the street. Suddenly, Klein felt his perception trigger as a scene surfaced in his mind. A grey rat was leaning against the carriage's window, leisurely watching the street scenery. Grey rat. Klein's eyelids twitched as he didn't hesitate to turn back into his half-open room, leave the balcony, and enter the master bedroom. He then entered the bathroom. He moved at an adequate pace, doing so as though he had been repeating this entire process like a daily routine. Locking the bathroom's door, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and passed through the grey fog filled with ravings and roars, finally taking his seat on the high-back chair of the fool. And before this, he made his valet, Enony, who was standing by the corridor, softly pray to sea god Carvatur. Using the corresponding point of light, he beckoned for the sea god's scepter and began expanding his vision. He then locked onto the carriage that was driving towards Mac's residence, 39 Bockland Street. And this time, the person leaning against the glass window and leisurely taking in the scenery was no longer a grey rat but a young man wearing a silk top hat and black trench coat. He had black hair and black eyes. His face was thin with a broad forehead. He wore a crystal monocle and had a faint smile on his lips. He was none other than the blasphemer, the angel of time, son of the creator, Amen. Although Klein was already mentally prepared, his anxiety made his entire body feel chilly. Amen had clearly appeared in his original form, but after stealing the rat demigod's destiny, he appeared as a grey rat in everyone's eyes without incurring any suspicion. He and his brother, Angel of Imagination Adam, had certain powers which were similar. It left terror in the mind of others the more they thought about it, but it was intrinsically different. If not for the grey fog and not for my deeper control of this place, I wouldn't have discovered it either. Klein felt a mix of joy and alarm as he expanded his vision to seek out Amen's avatars. Compared to the grafting of destiny, the signs of parasitizing was a lot clearer. However, Klein didn't notice anything this time. Be it the other passengers in the carriage, the horses that towed the carriage, or the surrounding trees and air, there wasn't any sign of parasitizing. This is different from what Leonard's grandpa said. Shouldn't the appearance of one Amen mean the accompaniment of many more Amens? He is clearly aware that he was discovered by a bizarro sorcerer of the Church of Evernite, and he suspects that Bockland Street is under surveillance. Therefore, he only sent a single avatar to investigate the situation. Klein frowned as he came up with theories. He was a little unsure of how to handle the current development. Of course, he recalled Palais Zoroast mentioning that as long as one avatar was resolved, he could eliminate all the Amons in Bockland Street. And now, there was only one Amon in Bockland Street, a perfect time to take action. I'll first hear what the expert's opinion is. Klein immediately conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow's figure at the other end of the long bronze table and made him reverently and piously pray. Honorable Mr. Fool, please inform Leonard Mitchell that Amon has appeared at 39 Bockland Street, but there's only one. While Gehrman Sparrow made the prayer, Klein didn't stop monitoring the carriage. He saw Hazel in a light-colored dress alight and enter her foyer. Amon, who was wearing a monocle and black trench coat, walked behind her with complete composure. Despite not having any concealment, the servants didn't notice him at all. It was as though there was only air or some inconspicuous creature behind Miss Hazel. Occasionally, the female servants would look at the ground and jump in fright. Just as they were about to scream, they would forget what they were about to do after their mouths opened. Amon passed through the foyer and walked up the stairs. Pinching the crystal monocle, Amon stuffed his hands into his pockets. Ring-transparent worms began squirming out of his body as they crawled in every direction before vanishing. This left Klein's scalp tingling. He recalled Palais Zoroast's description of Amon's parasitizing power, a plague-like infection. Hazel had been in an excellent mood recently. This was because her teacher hadn't truly gone mad. Everything that happened previously was only a test, and she had passed it with flying colors. This made her gain plenty of knowledge about the supernatural world. She learned the essence of the potions and grasped the acting method. She also gained the opportunity to advance to cryptologist. She was currently a sequence 7 beyonder. So the world actually has such a magical side to it. I wonder when I can become a demigod and shake off my mortal coils. Hazel glanced at the hanging wall clock and rubbed her sunken tummy. She decided to get her mother to bring forward the high tea session today. After all, there weren't any guests. At noon, she had used the excuse of heading out for a meal to bring her teacher back. She also took the opportunity to act and hadn't had anything to eat. Upon thinking that, she glanced at her teacher who was sprawled on a leather cushion on the sofa. The grey rat had raised its front paw and pressed on its right eye. "Do you need any food?" Hazel asked reverently. The rat lowered its front paw and answered unhurriedly, "There's no need." "All right, teacher." Hazel turned around and walked forward, opening the door to her bedroom. Her lady's maid was standing along the corridor, leisurely looking at the balcony at the end of the corridor as though she was admiring the afternoon sky. Hazel indiscernibly frowned and said, "Guard this place. Don't let anyone in." The lady's maid shot one glance at her and smiled. "Yes, miss." Only then did Hazel leave her bedroom and head for the activity room on the second story. She found her mother, Ma'am Rihanna. This lady with the same black-green hair received a pair of gem-embedded glasses with a gold chain hanging from it from her lady's maid. It was more an accessory than an eyesight correction tool. "Don't tell me that you don't like it," Hazel asked in puzzlement. The corners of Ma'am Rihanna's mouth curled slightly. "I like it now." As she said that, she wore the glasses. As Hazel was just about to say something, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned her head to find her father, Member of Parliament Macht, coming home early. "Father, didn't you say that you'd be at the military veterans mess?" Hazel asked in passing. There wasn't anyone there today. Macht raised his right hand and pinched the two sides of his eyes. Hazel thought nothing of it as she nodded. "Perfect, we haven't had high tea together in a long time." "That's right." Member of Parliament Macht and Ma'am Rihanna laughed at the same time as a faint smile appeared on their lips. At 7 Pinster Street, Leonard, who had just returned from St. Hyland Square, threw himself onto the sofa as he lifted his feet onto the coffee table. Having not received any information, he believed that the punishment operation had come to a perfect end, allowing him to look forward to the spoils of war. "Old man, didn't you say that the Sanguine Viscount had many mystical items on him? Can you tell me what they are?" Leonard softly asked in puzzlement. In his mind, Palais Zoroast harumphed. "Items of that level aren't worth my notice." Leonard was just about to press further when his vision suddenly blurred. He saw the boundless grayish-white fog and Gehrman Sparrow's blurry figure, as well as his prayer. "Amon has appeared at 39 Bockland Street, but there's only one." "Amon has appeared." That quickly. Leonard, who had already relaxed, retracted his feet immediately and sat straight up. He became more anxious than before the punishment operation began. He hurriedly informed Palais Zoroast of Klein's words and asked, "Old man, what do we do now?" "Begin the operation. But there's only one Aemon avatar." Palais Zoroast fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "If there's only one Aemon, it implies that he has other motives, but none of that matters. In the fourth epoch, there's a saying, there's no point crying over spilled milk. Since it has begun, we can't falter. If we delay this any further, Aemon will attempt to influence the entire street. When that happens, he will definitely discover Dwayne Dantes' abnormality." Klein returned to the real world and walked out of the bathroom. He had already made the corresponding preparations. He had creeping hunger on his left hand and an emblem carved from obsidian in his right. Then, he made Enony snap his fingers and use Flaming Jump to enter 39 Bockland Street, Member of Parliament Mac's house, with the appearance of Gehrman Sparrow. Control of the spirit body threads was instantly transferred to Klein, but this only seemed to sink into the vast ocean without any reaction. He had lost control of his marionette. Klein's eyelid twitched as he heard the door to the master bedroom creak open. It was Enony. This youth with Loan and Balam blood in him had pushed open the door and walked in, completely outside of Klein's control. He then took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and rubbed it with his sleeve. Then, he leisurely wore it on his right eye. He then looked at Dwayne Dantes, the corners of his mouth curling up. "Found you." The mood in the bedroom froze as Enony, who was pinching on the monocle, continued. "Flora Jacobs' destiny was filled with too many abnormalities, and they mainly came from this street. This piqued my interest, and I spent some time to distinguish and seek out the source. It took me so many days to find you. I'm no stranger to this mirror, and I can control it, but I've never seen it ingratiate itself so much towards one person. This really is an interesting matter. Perhaps, I should steal your destiny and see why that is the case." "Ah, right. You likely do not know of its origins. It's in no way simple. Wearing a monocle, Aemon, who wore the appearance of Enony, didn't seem like an infiltrator or assailant. Instead, he appeared like a visitor as he eagerly mentioned all the preparations he had done, as well as Rhodes's origins." He paused before he could finish his sentence. Dwayne Dantes opposite him had turned into a dirty grey rat. The rat raised its right claw, pressing at its eye. At the same time, in the garden of 160 Bockland Street, with his thin and cut, black-haired, brown-eyed face, Gehrman Sparrow appeared in the middle of a bunch of roses. Back when Aemon was saying something highly enticing, he had secretly split off a worm of time in an attempt to invade Klein's body in order to parasitize him. However, Klein had been on high alert the entire time. He detected this attempt via the changes in his spirit body threads, so he rapidly created a marionette at the critical moment and swapped locations. Silently, Aemon, who looked like a mixed-blood youth, appeared in front of Klein. Behind him, a 12-ring transparent worm fell from the third story and returned to his body. And at that instant, the earthworms in the garden soil, the insects in the woods, the rats in the shadows all crawled out, either swarming towards Gehrman Sparrow and Aemon or were fleeing from this region. The main reason why Klein had patiently listened to Aemon was to use that time to create marionettes. To a bizarro sorcerer, they were only complete with their marionettes. Aemon still wasn't in a rush to take action. He pinched the monocle embedded deep in his eye socket and looked around, saying with a smile, "Your actions often expose your problems. To a master of deceit, everything that you did was enough for me to detect your weakness. In such a tense and dangerous situation, you actually chose to convert rats, insects, birds, and earthworms into being your marionettes without considering your servants. What does this tell me? It says that you have outstanding moral standards. You still view yourself as human and are unwilling to harm them. Upon grasping this point, even if my avatar is inferior to you, it's still easy to break you down. You wouldn't even be capable of dying even if you wish for it. Ah, right. You can stop your attempts at secretly controlling my spirit body threads. This is because you're controlling the spirit body threads I stole. They belong to your butler, your maid, and your coachman. If this continues, I'm afraid you will feel a deep sense of guilt. Even spirit body threads can be stolen. No, it's more like grafting." Klein's expression froze slightly as he terminated his control of Aemon's spirit body threads. He had been patient, allowing Aemon to drone on with his drivel, mainly doing so because he was secretly trying to turn Aemon's avatar into his marionette. To a bizarro sorcerer, battles like this, where he stalled for time and exerted his influence in secret, should have been something he was best at and something he enjoyed the most. Unfortunately, he had encountered Blasphemer Eamon, the current pinnacle existence of the Marauder pathway. Even if he was only facing an avatar, he could do nothing about him. Klein actually suspected that Eamon's words were a ruse, but he wasn't able to see through it. He didn't dare take the risk. During such times, he needed the help of a spectator. For you to say so much, I doubt it's solely to think of the means to parasitize me, right? You should know that, before severely injuring me, it's very difficult to parasitize a bizarro sorcerer who can see spirit body threads, Klein calmly said as he wore Gehrman Sparrow's face. Eamon immediately chortled. You finally noticed it. You're trying to steal my destiny. Klein swapped locations with a marionette once again, constantly making his actual body appear in different corners of the garden. No. Eamon shook his head, keeping his hands in his pockets while leisurely saying with a smile, if a magic mirror like a Rhodes is willing to listen to your instructions and deliberately ingratiate itself towards you, it means that you aren't as simple as I imagined. I'm not a beyonder of the Tyrant pathway, so I wouldn't be so rash as to directly steal your destiny. Hey, I suddenly have a feeling that directly replacing you would result in something I don't wish to see happening. How did you know a Rhodes is ingratiating itself? Flora Jacobs' destiny shouldn't have something like that. Klein appeared on a tree. His different marionettes continued changing their locations. Eamon pulled out one hand and pinched his chin and said, Didn't I say why? I spent time to gather information and seek out the source. Oh, I went to the Church of Steam and had a chat with a Rhodes. It wasn't too frank, and it was willing to be tortured by me rather than reveal your true origins. Unfortunately, that was inside the Church of Steam, otherwise, I would have directly parasitized it and learn of everything. Even living sealed artifacts can be parasitized. If a Rhodes strictly abided by the rules, based on its answers in the past, he isn't too sure of my actual situation and only has certain guesses. Klein's eyes widened. Just as he was about to say something, he heard Eamon laugh and say, You really don't seem to be in a rush. What are you waiting for? Do you not know that my Pathways Sequence 2's name is Trojan Horse of Destiny? Although I'm only an ordinary avatar, I do have some powers that I can use, such as tinkering with your destiny, making certain errors appear for a certain period of time. For instance, no one will notice it no matter how much you cry for help. Hey, that also means that, even if you were to trigger the Evernight emblem in your hand, you will only be able to get the effects of concealment, and you will not be able to transmit your intentions of seeking help, regardless of your prior agreements. Also, even if you were to shout for help or create an explosion, the pedestrians and servants in the room wouldn't be able to hear a thing. This is the reason why I was talking so much. For an ordinary avatar, certain matters take time. Alright, it's your turn to answer my question. Klein didn't answer as he kept switching positions with his marionettes. However, Eamon kept appearing in front of him as they continued their conversation. At this moment, he made one of his marionettes ask, Since you've already completed the controlling of destiny, why aren't you taking action? You also seem to be waiting. Before this Gehrman Sparrow, who was a thin, paper figurine, could finish his sentence, there was a strong gust of wind from afar. Leonard, in a black trench coat and a black silver inlaid cane in hand, flew to Bockland Street. Klein, who had appeared to Eamon's side, immediately said, This is what I've been waiting for. As he said that, he triggered the Evernight emblem that he had been clasping tightly. Simultaneously, he snapped his left hand's fingers, igniting the tallest tree in the garden, making its scarlet flames soar into the sky. And this huge, obvious bonfire, that would have been noticeable at a glance from across the street, was noticed by no one, be it the maids wiping the windows on the first story or the pedestrians strolling beneath the Intis parasol trees. Even in midair, Leonard Mitchell ignored this scene, rushing for 39 Bockland Street at high speeds. And at this moment, Palais Zoroast's slightly aged voice sounded in this Red Gloves' mind, Turn back. Head to Unit 160. Although Leonard was puzzled, his experienced self didn't ask why when it came to supernatural matters. He immediately swung the direction word of the sea pointed and changed directions. In the garden of 160 Bockland Street, Eamon raised his head as he pressed the crystal monocle on his right hand, chuckling. This is also what I've been waiting for. He ignored Gehrman Sparrow as his smile grew obvious. He continued speaking in irresistible delight, to be able to discover the abnormalities of fate in this region. It's him, Palais. As he spoke, this blasphemer changed his actions and adjusted his monocle. At this moment, a strange gloom fell over the entire street. It was as though the entire place had been separated from reality, turning into a secret. In the activity room of 39 Bockland Street, Hazel looked out the window and muttered in puzzlement, "Is it about to rain?" This wasn't anything important, so she retracted her gaze and reached out her hand onto the 3-layered tray for high tea. Then, she saw her father, Member of Parliament Macht, strangely open his right palm. Glimmers of light condensed out of thin air, forming into a crystal monocle in his palm. Mac then wore this monocle on his right eye. This, Hazel had already sensed something amiss as she frantically looked at the others in the room. Her mother, Ma'am Rihanna, took off the accessory on her nose and wore a monocle that she had taken out of somewhere. The servants standing beside her all took out a similar monocle and wore it on their right eye. Thud. Hazel stood up instinctively as she retreated repeatedly, toppling the chair over in the process. This sound alarmed everyone in the room. Macht, Rihanna, and the servants turned their heads to look at Hazel. Bit by bit, a smile suffused the corners of their lips. Ah! Hazel broke down as she let out a shrill scream. This scream passed through the house and through the garden, drawing the attention of the pedestrians on the streets. At this point, Eamon had already lowered his right hand from his monocle. Looking at the figure in midair, he said with a smile, "Palais, it's already 1350 of the Fifth Epoch." The technique of relying on the gathering of avatars to raise one's level is already outdated. Behind him, Klein didn't waste any time as he reached into his pocket as though he was drawing a gun while he made creeping hunger turn transparent. A transparent book condensed in front of him. However, Eamon simply raised his hand and the glove vanished. However, along with the human-skinned glove's disappearance, Gairman Sparrow also did. Landing in Eamon's palm wasn't a glove but a rat that had died after becoming a marionette. On the other side of Eamon, Klein, who wasn't wearing a hat but was wearing a shirt and vest, appeared. He then threw out the item he had previously taken out, and he threw it at his target. It was a paper crane. It was an ordinary paper crane, bursting into scarlet-red flames just as it flew out, scattering ashes in the process. Eamon, who had been looking up into the sky, suddenly turned his head and looked at the paper crane, who was a vessel of flames. He then raised his palm again. A cold glint had lit up in the eye beneath the monocle. Suddenly, the flames on the paper crane's surface vanished. Klein and his ability to swap locations with his marionette vanished. Likewise for flame controlling, flaming jump, and air cannon. In that instant, he had 6 Beyonder powers stolen, 4 of which were rather important ones. If Eamon was able to make a few more thefts, then Klein might have even turned into an ordinary person. This was theft at the angel level. Amidst the extinguishing flames, the paper crane slowly floated. Backland, Dr. Aaron's house, in a black pram. Wrapped in silver silk, Will Orsepton rubbed his mouth and eyes, grumbling, "Life is just so hard." Before he finished his sentence, he took out what looked like a cane from somewhere. It was embedded with clear gems. Pure bright light lit up, illuminating the calendar in the room clearly. Today was Tuesday, 160 Bockland Street, inside Dwayne Dantes' garden. The paper crane, which was already charred and incomplete, suddenly froze in midair. Complicated chrome-colored symbols appeared out of it, instantly taking on the form of a huge, illusory, scaleless snake. The dense patterns and symbols on the surface of the gigantic silver snake formed a wheel that was connected to each other. Around each wheel were different symbols. With a sweep of the cold, bright red eyes, this giant serpent soared into the sky and stayed above Bockland Street. It curled its body and bit its own tail. Its shadow blanketed the entire street like a mysterious and ludicrous wheel. Suddenly, Macht, Rihanna, and several servants in 39 Bockland Street's activity room wiped the smiles from their faces. They raised their hands in unison, taking off the monocle on their faces, allowing the monocles to turn incorporeal in their hands before transforming into beams of light. Immediately following that, they wore their eye accessories once again and pinched their eye sockets, either leisurely looking out the window or returning to their former state. Hazel sat on the ground watching this scene. As she shook her head, feeling the world crumbling around her, she used her hands to hold her body up while rapidly retreating. The cold glimmer in Winner Anunni's eyes vanished. The crystalline monocle was left cooked, and he no longer wore that supercilious look. In addition, something in his body seemed to be extracted as a clear, thick, but transparent and mysterious worm of time took form above his head. And amidst concealment, this worm of time quickly transformed into a figure with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face. This wasn't time reversing itself on Bockland Street, because Klein and Leonard didn't suffer any of its effects. It was Eamon having his condition returned to a few minutes prior to this. Snake of Fate. Reboot. Although Will Orsepton had predicted that there would be some changes in fate, things had happened slightly later. However, his influence that descended from afar came in such a timely fashion. In order to gain this Snake of Fate's help, Klein had not only fed him 5 different flavors of ice cream, but he had also agreed to further compensation. The outcome of their negotiation was that Klein had to think of the means to create at least 2 items that could allow Will Orsepton to briefly regain some of his strength while in his weakened state. When Eamon suffered this unexpected blow, Klein didn't hesitate and drew Death Knell. He cocked it, gently pushed the cylinder, and aimed it at his enemy. Bang! He staidly and decisively pulled Death Knell's trigger, shooting out the control spirit bullet he had long prepared. A black stream of light flashed out, striking the illusory Eamon figure with the sharp bonnet and classic black robe, the Worm of Time. This was even thicker and clearer than all the Worms of Time Klein had previously seen before. The light scattered as Eamon's figure quivered in midair and froze without being able to wear any expression. And at this moment, Leonard, who had already arrived overhead, followed Old Man's instructions. Standing on Word of the Sea, he floated in midair, slightly spread out his arms, and relaxed his spirit body. Both his green eyes immediately reflected a slightly gloomy, 12-ring transparent worm of time in each one of them. These 2 worms of time had their heads and tails connected together, forming a similar loop. As the loop slowly spun, they projected a huge ancient mottled illusion behind Leonard. This illusion looked like the surface of a wall clock carved from stone. There were 12 segments, each segment was either grayish-white or bluish-black. They were clearly demarcated from each other, and the symbols were all different. With just one look, Klein had the feeling that life was speeding past him. Gong. A bell gong that seemed to travel across time from ancient history resounded through the spacious secret world. Everything before Klein seemed to slow down, including the Eamon figure above Enemy. An indescribable invisible surge appeared, sweeping around that Eamon figure before hurling it towards that huge, illusory stone-carved wall clock. What was actually a worm of time, Eamon's avatar with a monocle, suddenly extended a hand, aiming it at Gehrman Sparrow. Suddenly, Klein saw the skin on the back of his hand rapidly dry up as they wrinkled up, producing unobvious aged spots. The speed at which Eamon's illusory figure was being pulled away slowed down, but the process couldn't be interrupted. Finally, it contracted into the form of a ringed worm and was thrown towards the illusory, ancient stone-carved wall clock behind Leonard. Gong. Another bell gong sounded as the grayish-white and bluish-black clock's surface had an additional mottled hand. This hand quickly rotated a few segments, speeding up the sound of the gongs. Inside 39 and 160 Bockland Street, all kinds of resplendent glimmers of light flew out, pulled and attracted by that ancient, illusory, stone-carved wall clock. Law of Beyonder Characteristics Convergence. He had used the connection between the avatars and his higher level to strengthen the law of Beyonder Characteristic Convergence. Gong. Several streams of light from different spots in Bockland flew over. After everything calmed down, Klein's current appearance appeared in his mind. He had more white hair than black. His forehead and the corners of his mouth and eyes were covered with obvious wrinkles. His skin had sagged with several aged spots. He looked like an elderly gentleman, ready to pass away at any moment. At this moment, the clock's gonging sounded again. The grayish-white hand on the ancient, illusory stone-carved wall clock began spinning counterclockwise. 1 tick, 2 ticks, 3 ticks. Klein saw his skin rapidly recover its luster as the spots faded and vanished. In just seconds, he recovered his original appearance. Life had seemed to begin flowing in him again. Powers at the angel level are almost godlike. I only suffered some repercussions of it, and I nearly died of old age. I wonder if I can revive under such conditions. Klein observed his condition and hurriedly looked up and said to Leonard Mitchell, "How should the people parasitized by Eamon be rescued?" At this moment, the ancient, illusory clock behind Leonard rapidly faded away, turning into glimmers of light that drilled back into his body. Leonard cocked his head slightly as though he was listening to something. After a while, he said, "The Beyonder characteristics of the worms of time in him have been sucked out. The remaining parts have either been absorbed or have some remnants left behind. However, it wouldn't result in having an excessive influence on them." Old Man said that it won't be excessive, but it might be from the viewpoint of an angel. In short, they can pray to the deities they believe in and see if they can obtain a complete purification. However, without them explaining what exactly happened, the deities might not give a response. If you're afraid of any remnant effects, you can consider guiding them to pray to that existence. All the items that come from that will be yours. Perhaps having personally experienced a battle at the angel level, and having seen the snake of fate spectral form, Leonard's agitation and trembling could hardly be suppressed in an instant. The people on this street are basically the believers of the goddess, so how can I get them to pray to the fool? I don't wish to be thrown into the foggy town. The goddess is very aware of this matter. They will likely receive a response if they were to pray to her. Then, I can get Her Eminence Ariana to return the worms of time that they cough out to me. I can give her some. As Klein's thoughts raced, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He then asked in passing, will there be any side effects after a complete purification? Although he had some experience from Little Sun, this youth of the City of Silver wasn't an ordinary person. After listening for a moment, Leonard said, a little. As it's a deeper level of parasitizing, even if ordinary people were to experience a full recovery, there will be some level of influence left on them, such as them liking to wear monocles. Alright. Head back first. Leave the rest to me. Klein nodded and was glad that the parties involved in this battle weren't the kinds with obvious destructive might. Otherwise, it might not only be Bockland Street, but all of Northborough might not be left intact. In Pritz Harbor, a black-haired, black-eyed, thin-faced young man wearing a monocle rode on a bicycle as he leisurely returned home. He wore an obvious smile as he opened the letterbox and took out the newspapers and letters inside. After entering the house, the young man pinched the monocle on his right eye while tearing open the letters, reading their contents as he walked. This continued until he found a letter without any name on it. If all connection to us in Backland is lost, it means that Palais Zoroast might very well be hidden in the vicinity of Northborough's Bockland Street. Don't ask us why we're taking such risks. Life often requires some excitement, joy, and anticipation. 1. Author's note. To make the plot run smoothly, the details of a tarot gathering was skipped. As for Will's prediction, a deviation happened because of Eamon's ability to bore through fate. On 160 Bockland Street, after watching Leonard fly out of the world of concealment with the word of the sea in one hand, Klein turned his attention back onto his surroundings. He first observed Winner Enemy. He originally imagined that he couldn't use the marionette that had been parasitized by Eamon, but to his surprise, he realized that he could control his spirit body threads again. This, Klein was first stunned before he came to a realization. When Snake of Fate Will Septon used Reboot to reverse Eamon's condition in time, it also made the things he parasitize experience similar changes. Hence, Enemy had turned back into his marionette. As expected of the strongest power of a Monster Pathways Sequence 1. Klein heaved a sigh of relief before allowing his figure to fade away from where he stood. He teleported back to his master bedroom, leaving a bunch of marionettes around to defend against any accidents. Right on the heels of that, Klein entered the bathroom and headed above the grey fog. He used a Nunny's prayer light and began observing the entire street with the Sea God scepter in hand. Without a doubt, his focus was on his residence and Unit 39. He found butler Walter, housekeeper Tanager, member of Parliament Mact, Ma'am Rihanna, and many servants having remnant signs of being parasitized. They appeared somewhat in a daze. As for Hazel, she was on the brink of total collapse. Her hands were on the ground, having pushed herself backwards into the corner. Her back was leaning close to the wall as she huddled into a ball, trembling. Mact and company had noticed something wrong with her. They surrounded her in concern, hoping to know why. However, Hazel would scream loudly whenever they attempted to approach her. She would resist violently, so all they could do was stand meters away, wearing a panicked and helpless look. During this process, they would, from time to time, nudge the glasses or pinch their eye sockets. This only served to leave Hazel even more horrified. She appeared to be on the brink of losing control. Klein felt horrified when he saw this scene above the grey fog. He imagined a scene: Daddy Eamon, Mommy Eamon, Maid Eamon, Footman Eamon was circling around Hazel, trying to soothe her nerves but were helpless. They wore the same expression and the same monocle with different clothes. Even if Hazel were to hold out and not lose control, she would definitely develop mental problems. At the very least, she would be in a half-crazy state. Klein's thoughts raced as he lowered the Sea God scepter and returned to the real world. Bockland Street and the several streets remained enshrouded in darkness. It exuded a serene, tranquil, and profound feeling. This was a world that had already turned into a secret. Klein took down a hat, wore it on his head, and teleported to a director's office in 22 Phelps Street, Loan Charity Bursary Foundation. Audrey had already changed into a light green dress and was daydreaming with a fountain pen in hand, reminiscing over every detail of the punishment operation in the afternoon. Susie, on the other hand, had gone out for a stroll. Suddenly, this noble lady sensed something and looked up. A black-haired, brown-eyed, thin-faced figure with cut facial features was rapidly reflected in her emerald, limpid eyes. This figure wore a white shirt, black vest, black trousers, and black leather boots. He had a cold expression, his body was bent slightly as he held one hand over his top hat. Audrey was first taken aback before she recalled who this person was. Gairman Sparrow. Although she had never met him before, she had already seen his extremely lifelike picture on the papers and wanted posters. Klein realized that he hadn't changed back to Dwayne Dantes based on Miss Justice's reaction. However, he wasn't too mindful of that. He released his hand from his top hat and straightened his body. He said with a nod, "There's something that requires your help." His disguise had also been stolen by Eamon. But after a reboot, it was returned to him. He just didn't have the time to change back into Dwayne Dantes. Mr. World, who's already a demigod, needs my help. He's in need of therapy because of some mental problem. No, it doesn't seem to be the case. Audrey pursed her lips as she put down her fountain pen in anticipation and curiosity. She stood up and gave a serious reply, "No problem." Klein didn't waste any time and walked over. Grabbing her by the arm, their figures faded away as they vanished from the spot. Instantaneously, they appeared outside the activity room at 39 Bockland Street. This is teleportation. Audrey's eyes turned slightly as she instinctively wanted to ask something. However, when she felt the heavy atmosphere and the screams, her face immediately wore a solemn look. "There's a patient?" she asked without much doubt. It's really easy to talk to a spectator. There's no need for much explanation. Klein tersely acknowledged and said, "Yes, she encountered a supernatural incident and suffered a terrible fright. She's on the brink of losing control. Do you have the means to not be seen by the people inside?" There was no need for him to say his last sentence, as a large-scale illusion was enough to resolve the problem. Furthermore, after receiving the blessings of concealment, ordinary people likely didn't retain much of the corresponding memories. However, after witnessing Adam's powers of invisibility, Klein was rather curious if Miss Justice had such skills at Sequence 6. Mr. World is feeling curious. That's really rare. He doesn't seem to be wearing a thick mask and has changed to a thinner one. He's a really good patient who heeds medical advice. Audrey's chin moved slightly as she nodded. Yes. As she spoke, she glanced at Gairman Sparrow, who reached out for the handle and pushed open the door after receiving her response. Member of Parliament Mact and Ma'am Rihanna completely ignored this beautiful girl as they discussed in a panic about hiring a doctor. As for Hazel, she remained curled in a corner, trembling vigorously like an abandoned baby animal. Miss Hazel. As a senior spectator, Audrey didn't have the problem of forgetting others. She observed Hazel's condition and frowned slightly. She turned her head and said to Gairman Sparrow, Mr. Sparrow, can you briefly explain what she encountered? Only with sufficient knowledge can I quickly resolve the problem. Klein was already prepared as he quickly and succinctly explained, she's a beyonder of the Marauder pathway, a student of a demigod who had nefarious thoughts. Her teacher attracted blasphemer Eamon's avatar and ended up getting herself killed. Her destiny and identity was stolen. As such, Eamon infiltrated her family, parasitizing her parents and servants. Just now, while we were eliminating Eamon's avatars, she realized that her parents and servants had all turned into Eamon. She didn't know that was Eamon, but she understood that it was a strange existence. If you have anything you wish to understand at a deeper level, things which do not involve the psychological treatment, you can always ask during the next gathering. Blasphemer Eamon. Mr. World and company have eliminated Eamon's avatar again. No, avatars. Audrey was somewhat shocked as she instinctively glanced at Mact and company. She couldn't imagine that they had once been parasitized by Eamon and had turned into him. To have everyone parasitized. Audrey recalled Mr. World's words and felt more afraid the more she thought about it. She felt her entire body turn cold as she couldn't help but think of herself if she were in Hazel's shoes. This left her somewhat stifled as she subconsciously cast placate on herself. Is the supernatural world always this cruel and terrifying, or is it just occasionally? After calming down, Audrey muttered softly. She didn't wait for the World Gairman Sparrow's reply, because from what she had seen at the tarot gathering, she knew the answer very well, always. Looking back at Hazel, Audrey walked over, filled with pity. She crouched down and first used placate. Hazel looked up blankly and saw a perfect, flawless face, as well as that pair of emerald-like eyes. At that instant, she seemed to return to the ball of that previous night, having witnessed this lady descend like an angel. She instantly calmed down. She saw ripples rise up in that pair of limpid, green eyes. They were serene, calm, and deep. There's no need to be afraid. Calm down. Everything is already over. Audrey used hypnosis to directly communicate with Hazel's body of heart and mind. She heard hysterical screams and the horror that was taller than mountains and deeper than the ocean. Taking into account Hazel's condition and encounter, she quickly came up with a plan for treatment. She directly hypnotized Hazel and made her forget today's encounter and the existence of her teacher. She was only capable of vaguely remembering her identity as a Beyonder and other general knowledge. Hazel gradually calmed down before she slowly fell asleep. After you awaken, that terrifying experience will no longer exist, and I was never here. Audrey used a gentle voice to complete the last step of the hypnosis. Following that, she slowly got up and observed Hazel for a few seconds. She pursed her lips and whispered without turning her head, I made her temporarily forget the corresponding memories, but that memory remains. It's just hidden deep down. In future gatherings, I'll continue treating her, guiding her to slowly remember and accept this memory. Only then can her mental problem be completely resolved. Otherwise, perhaps a familiar action or sentence will jolt her awake. She will then break down once again, and perhaps it will result in a direct loss of control. Miss Justice is becoming more and more professional. Klein sighed as he asked cautiously, then you will have to hypnotize all the people who were parasitized. They are not to show any hobbies that don't originally belong to them, like the wearing of monocles. Also, let them pray to the Evermite goddess after 15 minutes to obtain complete cleansing and purification. Audrey nodded with abnormal seriousness. No problem. Klein immediately stood to the side, watching this noble lady, everyone who had been parasitized in this house with the greatest feelings of pity. Minutes later, Klein, with the face of Gairman Sparrow, walked out of 39 Bockland Street with Miss Justice Audrey and headed for places where the other parasite victims were. After a few silent steps, Klein suddenly looked ahead and said, it's not rare to see such matters happen among unaffiliated Beyonders. Without any suitable guidance, it often implies that they're constantly dancing at the edge of a cliff with the possibility of falling at any time. Audrey tersely acknowledged and said after a few seconds, I know. Compared to before, I'm not as. She deliberated for a moment before breaking into a grimacing smile, as though she had found a suitable adjective she required to mock herself. Naive. Phew. She then exhaled without hiding it as she looked ahead. If I had known that the mysterious world was so cruel and terrifying last June, I might not have raised the request of becoming a Beyonder. Klein turned his head slightly and took a look at the noble lady's face. He asked in a seemingly casual manner, if I were to give you the chance now to completely leave the mysterious world, would you accept it? Audrey was taken aback as she slowly pursed her lips and said, no. After giving such a response, she seemed to relax a little as she smiled and continued, under the premise of knowing how cruel and terrifying the mysterious world is, the me from last June would have given up being a Beyonder. But the me of this year wouldn't. This might be the price of growing up. I understand what you're getting at. Klein continued forward at the same pace as he said, after those victims are completely purified, a number of them will spit out worms of time. They can be used to create fate siphon charms. It's a demigod-level item that can switch the fate between two parties for a short period of time. When the time comes, I'll give you one as payment for today's treatment. Audrey was about to decline it before she fell silent again. She then nodded gently and said, okay, Wu Shi AW or LD. CT. Just as she said that, she suddenly paused. She turned her head to glance at Gairman Sparrow and smilingly said with a mixed expression, I know why you just asked me that question. Klein chuckled without giving a direct answer. Audrey retracted her gaze and immediately felt a lot better. She asked as though they were having a chat, I participated in the punishment operation at noon, and I dealt with the Amen aftermath in the afternoon. Today is really a tarot day. Her words were a double entendre as she said with utmost wistfulness. From her point of view, Noon was a cooperative operation that involved 5 members: the Moon, the Star, Judgment, Justice, and the Magician, with different levels of involvement. In the afternoon, the tarot clubs The World and Justice had involved themselves in the elimination of Eamon's avatars in different ways. This was indeed a day to remember, and in a sense, it could be considered a tarot day. Klein nodded in agreement at Miss Justice's words, but he didn't tell her that the Star Leonard had also been involved in the afternoon operation. Furthermore, he was the main force in the operation. Eamon's avatar must have been difficult to deal with, right? Audrey finally found an opportunity to raise the question. She stared at Gehrman Sparrow, making no attempt to hide the curiosity in her green eyes. Klein smiled. If I had done it alone, you wouldn't be seeing Gehrman Sparrow, but Eamon here instead. Having your destiny and identity stolen? Audrey asked in enlightenment. Klein tersely acknowledged. We'll discuss the specifics in the future. In short, to eliminate all of the Eamon avatars in Backland this time, we had mobilized angels. If you were to encounter Eamon's avatars in the future, never believe that you have the means to handle him alone. Immediately find an opportunity to seek help. Yes, his trait is the wearing of a monocle. He enjoys pulling off harrowing pranks. Angels were mobilized. I wonder if it was that death consul or the angel from the Fate Domain, or... Audrey looked up at the sky and saw the clouds frozen in midair. They appeared like props under the dark background. Like an attentive student listening to a teacher, she seriously nodded and said, I will keep that in mind. The two continued walking, occasionally silent, occasionally breaking out into a conversation until they entered 160 Bockland Street. After a few minutes, inside the activity room of Hazel's house, Macht and company suddenly had the strong urge to sit in their seats, raise their hands, and place their clasped hands before their mouth. They then began to piously pray and chant the Evernite goddess's honorific name. After an unknown period of time, they coughed in unison until their tears and snot flowed out. Cough, cough, cough. Without realizing it, they separately coughed out worms with 12 translucent rings. The moment these worms fell to the ground, they vanished without garnering any notice. Similar things happened in other places of Bockland Street, but everything was quickly restored to normal. And the darkness had faded away at some point in time as the clouds began churning again from the sweeping winds. Amidst her parents' coughing, Hazel slowly regained consciousness. She was puzzled as to how she fell asleep on the sofa during high tea. She felt that she should have been in an excellent mood, but she just couldn't bring herself to smile. She felt as though there was a feeling of indescribable sadness and pain bearing over her heart. Upon seeing her parents' concerned gaze landing on her, not only wasn't she touched, she even felt a little fearful. She trembled like an introvert who wasn't accustomed to making contact with others. Hazel knew that this wasn't her personality, but she couldn't control herself. However, she didn't find it weird or puzzling as she continued enjoying the high tea pastries. Macht and Rihanna felt the same. They had a nagging feeling that there was something hazy about their memories, but they just couldn't recall what. 160 Bockland Street. In the master bedroom, which had its curtains drawn, a figure suddenly outlined itself across the coffee table. It was the barefooted Ariana, leader of the ascetics, matron of the Evernite cloister, head of the 13 archbishops of the Church of Evernite. She was wearing a Spartan robe with tree bark as her belt. In the lady's eyes, the grey sideburn Dwayne Dantes was about to leave the sofa. On the coffee table in front of him were 9 transparent ringed worms. Good afternoon, Ma'am Ariana, Klein said with a solemn bow. Thanks to your help, Eamon's avatars in Backland have all been eliminated. You can choose a portion of these spoils of war. He had previously prepared a marionette beside every person who had been parasitized, and he used an illusion to bring these worms of time back. After hearing him, Ariana tapped her chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion and replied in a pious manner, "Praise the lady." She didn't decline the offer or stand on ceremony. She reached out her right hand, and 2 worms of time flew up and landed in her palm. Eamon must have certain guesses about this. You still have to be careful in the future, Ariana said simply before her figure vanished inch by inch as though she had been erased. Watching this Archbishop leave, Klein sat down and picked up a pen and paper, writing to Leonard Mitchell. He wanted to ask what other effects the worms of time had other than creating fate siphon charms. He believed that he couldn't turn all the remaining worms of time into fate siphon charms, as it would be too monotonous. It made it easy to be counted, and it prevented him from handling different situations. Therefore, he had to consider other possible uses. With the Worm of Time as a vessel, he could use the powers stirred from other symbols, patterns, and labels that differed from the Fool. This would likely result in different effects from the Fate Siphon charm. And this was something Palais Zoroast was an expert at. After writing his letter, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew at it. Rionette walked out of the void with the 4 blonde, red-eyed head in hand. The 8 eyes paused before looking at the remaining 7 worms of time on the coffee table. Miss Messenger looked at it for 3 full seconds before retracting her gaze. She then bit on the letter and gold coin which Klein handed over. "Still 7 Pinster Street," Klein succinctly said. Rionette Tinniker's remaining 3 heads replied, "In the future, you can seek my help in such matters. The payment will be the toils of war." Klein was taken aback as he said, "All right." After Miss Messenger returned to the spirit world and vanished from his room, he frowned and muttered, "Since she can recognize the Worms of Time, it means that she knows that this battle might have escalated to the level of angels. She wasn't afraid at all. Miss Messenger is stronger than I imagined." 7 Pinster Street. Leonard received Klein's letter from Rionette Tinniker's mouth. He still felt a hint of excitement as he eagerly unfolded the letter and read it. After the messenger left, he immediately asked with a suppressed voice, "Old man, there should be other ways to create charms, right?" Just now, Palais Zoroast had given him 2 Worms of Time from Amon as today's reward for the risk he took. In Leonard's mind, the slightly aged voice replied with a smiling tone, "Of course, once I sleep for a while and digest what we received this time, I'll teach you. It wouldn't take too long. Also, do not go to Bockland Street anytime soon." "Why?" Leonard asked in surprise. Palais Zoroast chuckled and said, "All of Amon's avatars in Backland have been eliminated, and it is in no way a trivial matter. The number of people who can do that is just a handful. So, do you think he will have some guesses?" Leonard's nerves tensed up again. Palais continued, "However, there's no need to be too worried. His true body wouldn't be able to enter Backland, and having recovered quite significantly, I don't have to be too worried about his avatars. In addition, I've found a piece of information from Flora Jacob from his memory fragments. Somewhere in Backland hides the treasure of the Jacob family. We shall wait until the end of the year for the gathering. There, we will seek out and cooperate with the other descendants of the Jacob family to excavate that treasure trove to share the items inside. When that happens, even if Amon gathers a large number of avatars, raising it to almost the level of a Sequence 1, there's no way he can truly defeat me. Hey, to ensure balance, Dwayne Dantes can also be involved in it." Leonard immediately felt very relieved when he heard Old Man Palais. He cast his attention back to the angel-level battle that happened in the afternoon and asked rather curiously, "Which Pathways angel does that giant serpent phantom belong to?" Palais Zoroast fell silent for a moment before saying with a sigh, "Snake of Fate. The counselor of the Life School of Thought. A Sequence 1 angel. I never expected him to join them. Counselor of the Life School of Thought. He has also become a blessed of Mr. Fool. The corresponding card is the Wheel of Fortune." Leonard's eyes widened as he realized that Mr. Fool's faction seemed comparable to the 7 Orthodox churches. It was truly unfathomable. Death Consul. Snake of Fate. Incomplete Messenger. There are 3 angels under Mr. Fool. It's no wonder Klein was able to become a demigod so quickly. Just how long has it been, and I've already been embroiled in a battle at the angel level. It's really unimaginable how things will develop in the future. Leonard held the letter and sat on the sofa. He felt another sense of urgency towards digesting his Soul Assurer potion and advancing to Spirit Warlock. He had been busy placating the souls in the Backland region recently, but due to the numerous missions, he was still far from completing them. He couldn't find an excuse or opportunity to visit Tingen City to steal the powers from that drop of the eternal blazing sun's blood. Furthermore, the arrival of Amon's avatars had been quicker than he had expected. South of the bridge, Rose Street, Harvest Church. Emlyn White, who had changed into a brown priest robe, stood in front of a long table with candle stands. He watched Ernst Boyar working hard at wiping the altar before he raised his right hand and casually pointed. "To the side. Left side. That spot's dirty." Ernst Boyar, who also wore the clergyman attire of the Earth Mother, shot an angry look at Emlyn, but he still listened to his instructions and re-wiped the area he hadn't wiped seriously. "I know you're very mad. It's how I felt when I learned that you deliberately hid key information from the ancient castle intel you sold me," Emlyn said with a smile, completely unfazed by his glare. Also, I forgot to inform you. I'm also a Viscount. It happened last week. Sanguine Viscounts corresponded to the Moon Pathways Sequence 5 Scarlet Scholar. The advancement ritual required the illumination of the full moon. Apart from that, one had to gather different metals, gems, and beyond a creature blood that represented the different moon phases. It was rather complicated. However, Emlyn had long obtained the promise from the sanguine upper echelons that a free advancement ritual would be held for him. He could advance easily once the full moon came. As for the digestion of potions professor, he had completed digesting it without putting too much effort into it. This was because he often taught commoners who were willing to learn at the Harvest Church to learn about herbs and medicine, and even combinations of some special potions. And apart from usually collecting dolls, researching history, and doing volunteer work at the cathedral, he loved thinking about the different potions and considering how they could be used in different battle situations. You're a Viscount. Ernst Boyar abruptly stood up straight as he wore a flabbergasted look. Among the sanguine, as they were all long-lived, they had quite a huge population. The number of Beyonder characteristics was limited, so advancing was a very difficult endeavor. One had to be in a long line before they had the opportunity to advance. However, Emlyn White had only been a Baron for half a year. Ernst remembered that it took him 6 years to go from Baron to Viscount. This was because his father had suffered an attack from artificial vampires. His passing left him the inheritance. Of course, Emlyn's smug smile grew obvious, but he remained restrained. I obtained a sequence 5 Beyonder characteristics from artificial vampires. Ernst Boyar looked at Emlyn, momentarily at a loss for words. He felt that he had suffered a heavier blow than needing to do volunteer work at the Harvest Church. Your expression is rather interesting. Emlyn tsked and said, perhaps one day, you'll have to address me as Lord when I become an Earl. Preposterous. What arrogance. Ernst blurted. I'm already very humble. I didn't mention I would become a duke or even a princeps. How am I to be the Sanguine's messiah without being an angel? Besides, in our tarot club, Mr. World has already advanced to become a demigod. Ma'am Hermit won't take much longer. This will definitely be a club filled with demigods. Emlyn chortled without arguing with Ernst like he usually would. He took on an attitude that whatever Ernst said was beneath him. Of course, he also understood that the advantage the Sanguine had after the Scarlet Scholar stage no longer existed. Becoming an Earl was in no way easier than an artificial vampire advancing to Shaman King. The digestion of the Scarlet Scholar potion is still relatively simple. All one needs to do is sincerely like the moon, worship the moon, and study the moon. This is what most Sanguine do usually. However, the corresponding ritual is in the hands of the demigods. Without their approval, even if I were to obtain a Shaman King beyond a characteristic from the sun, I won't be able to become an Earl. Emlyn might be arrogant, but he knew very clearly what was required of him subsequently. There were two core powers of Scarlet Scholar. First, it was to create an environment that was advantageous to them. When the enemy wasn't good at spirituality or things related to the spirit world, they could create the effects of the full moon. On the contrary, they would also make the moon vanish if necessary. Second, it was to gain an instantaneous blink and a spectral form state under a certain area of the moon's illumination. Even if they were smashed to bits by an enemy, they could still reform themselves under the moonlight. And the strength of these powers was derived from one's comprehension and research of the moon domain as Scarlet Scholars. As for the strengthening of darkness-related spells, the enhancements of potion effects, and the resistance towards nightmare-like influences, they were just supplementary. Ernst was enraged by Emlyn's attitude. Just as he was about to speak again, he saw the mountain-like half-giant, Utreski, walk out from behind the cathedral. He hurriedly bent his back and bowed his head as he continued cleaning the altar. Emlyn White also picked up his cloth and the candle stand, wiping its surface with great proficiency. In the silent atmosphere, he thought of something. If he were to leave the Harvest Church now, would the upper echelons of the Sanguine force him to hand over the mystical items and supernatural props he obtained from Ernst? I really have no reason to reject their request, because some of the items don't belong to Ernst in the first place. Emlyn thought about it seriously and decided to return to the room later. He would set up a ritual and sacrifice the spoils of war he received to Mr. Fool. When the time came, he could split it with the other members like the Star and Justice. Oath of Rose cannot be sacrificed. It's only one part of the pair. Whoever obtains it will be discovered and identified by the wielder of the other ring. I'll just treat it as a spoil of war. I'll hand it over to Marquis Nibs tonight. I should be able to exchange it for some rewards. As for the rest, I won't participate in the splitting." Emlyn very quickly came up with a plan. As for whether the sanguine upper echelons would bear a grudge over this, he wasn't too worried. This was because he would also mention in passing about the cooperation that the Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction had requested while handing over the Oath of Rose. This matter had happened last week. He had planned on informing the sanguine upper echelon, but in the few mini-gatherings, the Hanged Man had advised him to do so after the punishment operation. It would accentuate his importance and mitigate any anger or resentment. Striking with a stick, and offering a carrot. At that moment in time, Emlyn suddenly had a deeper understanding of the suggestion. 160 Bockland Street. Inside Dwayne Dantes' bedroom. The spoils of war received a pretty good. A diamond brooch that can raise one's energy and maintain lucidity while resisting spells that act on the body of heart and mind. A paper figurine that can prevent any fatal damage and psychic piercing. A belt that can produce sun and lightning damage. A wallet that contains more than £300. After receiving the sacrifice and returning to the real world, Klein silently sighed as he sat in front of his study desk. He then took out a transparent maggot. Upon seeing this maggot, he felt his head ache, recalling the pain of having his soul body fracture. This was a worm of spirit that he had fractured from himself. It was to be made into the payment given to Snake of Fate Will Orsepton. He already had an idea on how to replicate the item which could briefly allow someone to restore their strength. It was to use the Worm of Spirit as a vessel and copy the complete symbol from before to garner a response from the mysterious space above the grey fog. For this, the outcome of his divination was that it would be rather successful. That item's true essence is actually one of the powers of the Seer Pathways Sequence 3, Scholar of Yore. To borrow a portion of one's power from one's past self. Responding with the Fool's identity would definitely work. The only problem is that the corresponding dimensionality, mystery, complexity, and danger of the symbols cannot be directly engraved on different metal plates. According to Will Orsepton, I have to use cogitation and draw on my spirituality to draw it on the Worm of Spirit. If it succeeds, I'll make myself one. I'll look at myself from the past and see if it will be Klein Moretti's childhood or myself hanging in the cocoon above the door of light. If it's the latter, it's best if I can confirm how long I've been hanging. Klein entered a cogitation state while in thought. Then, he kept constructing symbols with his mind, allowing his spirituality to repeat this process outside as it penetrated the Worm of Spirit. This was a complicated and difficult task. If he wasn't careful, it might lead to failure. As the invisible symbols fell and augmented the Worm of Spirit, Klein suddenly trembled. The Worm of Spirit ignited by itself and turned to ashes. Looking at his empty palm, Klein felt a headache. After a long period of silence, he silently muttered, "Life sure is difficult." After rubbing his forehead, Klein was just about to split another Worm of Spirit when he suddenly saw Rionette in her dark, complicated-looking dress walk out of the void and stand beside the desk. In the mouth of one of Miss Messenger's heads was a neatly folded letter. "Who's it from?" Klein asked in passing. Rionette Tinniker's remaining 3 heads replied, "The Mushroom King's Superior, Mushroom King." Klein was stunned for a full 2 seconds before realizing that it could be Frank Lee. And Frank Lee's superior was Admiral of Stars, Catlia. "The Mushroom King is Frank Lee?" Klein asked in confirmation as he reached out to take the letter. With the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads' hair being held, they were made to bob up and down as though they were nodding. Miss Messenger even gives others nicknames. That's not right. Frank doesn't just specialize in mushrooms. His domains include cows, malt, fish, rose bishops. It's because Frank has had a breakthrough in his mushroom experiments, so Miss Messenger saw a boat full of mushrooms. Klein couldn't help but draw a breath as he hurriedly unfolded the letter. He was worried that the letter was Ma'am Hermit's plea for help. Of course, he wasn't too anxious because, at the most critical juncture, an experienced pirate like Admiral of Stars would definitely choose to pray to Mr. Fool. This letter did come from the future's captain, Catlia. On it were neatly written words. "The Queen has already confirmed the time and place. Wednesday, 11 p.m. same place. I've no idea what you said to Frank Lee, but I can tell that he has been very excited recently. He has done many experiments with the artisan. He said that he would be able to produce another phase of results in 3 to 6 months' time. He also made it clear that if he were to obtain the Druid Potion, he could save on making many intermediary objects and directly produce the final outcome. All I can say is that I wish you the best." I hope that everything will come to an end before the artisan completely breaks down. He has already begun regretting his faith in the primordial moon. Should I be happy that the securing of the City of Silver's food supply has progressed, or should I be worried about accidents? Klein rubbed his temples and decided to put the matter aside. After all, Ma'am Hermit, who was almost about to become a demigod, was watching Frank. If some unexpected development really happened, she would definitely seek help. Phew! Having finally confirmed his meeting with Queen Mystic, he heaved a sigh of relief and flicked his wrist, burning the letter in scarlet red flames. After watching Miss Messenger leave, he continued splitting a worm of spirit when he suddenly frowned. He felt that the desk and the letter's ashes in the trash can were abnormally off-putting. Subconsciously, Klein got some tissue and wiped the desk before covering the trash can. After doing all of this, he looked at his dirtied hands and stood up. He headed for the washroom and turned on the tap. As he washed his hands, he caught sight of the toilet beside him through the corner of his eye. He frowned bit by bit again. Today's cleaning wasn't done well enough, Klein softly muttered and suddenly sensed something wrong with him. Amidst his thoughts, his spiritual intuition quickly explained why he was feeling this way. This was a side effect of using Death Knell. As he had already become a demigod, allowing him to have a qualitative change in his spirit body and attain godhood, the corresponding negative effects had been reduced by more than 90%. The terrifying weakness of germophobia ended up becoming a trait of cleanliness OCD. Likewise, the period of weakness dropped from 6 hours to 1 hour. And the thirst that Death Knell gave him was no longer as obvious. Thankfully, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he skillfully pulled out the toilet brush from the side. 11 in the evening, above the grey fog, due to Emlyn White's request, all the members who had involved themselves in the punishment Operation Justice, the Star, Judgment, the Magician, and the Hanged Man appeared inside the ancient magnificent palace. These are all the spoils of war. Emlyn threw £3,000 that he had just sacrificed in the middle of the table and explained, one of the mystical items was Oath of Rose. It's a paired ring, allowing the wearers to be able to share their senses and thoughts with one another within a normal-sized city regardless of the distance. It's very valuable, but only one of the rings was acquired. It would spell danger for anyone who takes it. Therefore, I handed it over to the sanguine upper echelons and received £3,000 in return. He originally thought of keeping the £3,000 as his spoils of war, but he decided that it was better to sacrifice it and make it be one of the options. After a pause, Emlyn introduced the other items, listing their uses and negative side effects. He had even added more to the description. Knowledge stemmed from his penchant for sanguine history and some shared by Ernst Boyar under Father Utreski's watch. He is doing it with the intent of flaunting. Otherwise, with Mr. Moon's character, he wouldn't say so much. Oh, the reason for him being relaxed is due to Mr. Fool's absence. Audrey watched as a bystander without saying which item she wanted. Alger glanced at the spoils of war and said to Emlyn, "Have you met the sanguine upper echelons? Has the hunting of the key members of the Rose School of Thought been confirmed?" "Pretty much. I've also established contact with a member from the Temperance faction. However, he wishes to carry out the operation after September." Emlyn didn't hide the truth, believing that Mr. Hanged Man could provide useful pointers. Indeed, Alger nodded and asked, "It has to be after September?" This means that they are waiting for something that will drastically change the situation. Klein, who was waiting for the mini-gathering to end somewhere else in the ancient palace, suspected that it had something to do with Miss Sharon's advancement when he heard that. According to Miss Sharon, she should have been able to attempt the demigod ritual in July. Don't tell me that this ritual will last at least a month. If that's the case, it's quite different from the other pathways. Klein had a theory he wasn't too sure about. Possibly. Emlyn thought for a while before agreeing with Mr. Hanged Man's words. Following that, he surveyed the area and said with a smile, "You can begin choosing." Audrey had Mr. World's promised Fate Siphon Charm, and Leonard had obtained the corresponding rewards from Old Man Palais. They appeared rather calm with the spoils of war, offered by the Sanguine Viscount. None of them rushed to speak as they politely waited for the others to go first. In addition, they had either experienced an angel-level battle in person or witnessed the horror brought about by Amon's avatars. Furthermore, they had confirmed that the Tarot Club contained potent forces, and they were suffering from some level of mental fatigue. Zio looked to her right before looking forward. Seeing everyone being so modest, she broke the silence. "I was involved in a very simple part of this and didn't take much of a risk. Furthermore, Mr. Moon has already paid £60 in advance.
I'll just take the cash in the wallet." As she spoke, she took the handcrafted wallet, took out the cash, and counted it. £335. Emlyn surveyed the area and nodded when no one objected. "Okay." As for the handcrafted wallet, Zio threw it in the middle of the table and returned it to Mr. Moon to handle it himself. With Zio taking the lead, Fours said, "I only lent out Leymano's travels and didn't take on any risks. I'll take that moon paper figurine." Compared to the mystical items, such expendable Beyonder items were relatively lower in value. However, to the magician herself, she wouldn't have selected a mystical item even if she was qualified. This was because she could hire the corresponding member to record it if she needed a particular power of the mystical item. As for moon paper figurine, an expendable item that could take a fatal blow and psychic piercing once, it couldn't be recorded. It was definitely the first choice for someone who feared for her life. After saying that, she waited for a moment. Only when no one objected did she take the moon paper figurine. Emlyn then cast his gaze at Miss Justice. Leonard extended his hand and said with a smile, "Ladies first." Audrey didn't decline the offer as she swept her gaze across the items on the table. She pointed at the diamond brooch and said with a smile, "I'll take this." She had heard Mr. Moon mention that its name was Alcohol Nemesis. It kept the wearer brimming with energy with lucidity in their thoughts, giving them resistance to influences on the body of heart and mind. Thankfully, I had first used Bribe Charm to be safe, and with Ernst still being in a half-conscious state after waking up from the dream, I wouldn't have been able to hypnotize him. This item is also useful to me. At the very least, it will give me another layer of protection when facing the higher-level members of the Psychology Alchemists. I don't have to worry about the negative effects if I don't always wear it. Audrey thought thankfully as she retracted her gaze from the diamond brooch in satisfaction. After the selection, Emlyn didn't give Leonard the chance to speak as he directly said, "This moon sash is yours." From his point of view, the moon sash was worth more than £5,000, something more valuable than the £3,000 in cash. Actually, I was leaning towards taking the £3,000. I have to buy the Word of the Sea, and the price is still £10,000 after Klein gave a discount. After spending that, I'll only have £650 in savings. Leonard ultimately didn't reject it as he nodded. "Okay." Emlyn finished distributing the spoils of war and picked up the remaining £3,000 in cash. He then split a stack and pushed it to the side. "Mr. Hanged Man, this is your payment. £1,000. You should call it the consultation fee." Without Mr. Fool present, Fours was also a lot more relaxed. Alger didn't stand on ceremony as he nodded, reaching out to take the stack of cash. "The compensation for the carriage driver will also be borne by me." Emlyn surveyed the area in a rather good mood. 11 p.m. on Wednesday, at the south entrance of the Backland Bridge. A figure quickly phased into existence in the night sky, with one hand on his hat and the other hand by his buttons. He had black hair, brown eyes, and sharp facial features. This strongest adventurer with the cold expression was none other than Gairman Sparrow. It was late at night with the thick clouds concealing the moon. It was dark across the Backland Bridge. Just as Klein teleported here, he saw green pea vines descend from the sky like a storm that enveloped his surroundings before he could look around. They intertwined and quickly formed a forest. They stacked upwards in layers, making it impossible to see its peak. Klein released his right hand's grip on his top hat and familiarly followed up the path paved by the vines. It didn't take long before he saw a naturally formed swing made out of green plants. He also saw Queen Mystic Bernadette who stood beside the swing. This eldest daughter of Emperor Roselle had a head of long chestnut hair. She wore a blouse with laced flowers that formed a bow tie. She matched it with a grey dress that went past her knees and a pair of Wellington leather boots. She also wore a bonnet with a hanging black fishnet. "You've grown faster than I had imagined." Bernadette's blue eyes behind the black fishnet reflected Gairman Sparrow's figure. Klein replied without any change in expression, "Praise Mr. Fool." As he said that, he inwardly lampooned, "This is what it means to strive to be stronger, relying on oneself rather than on others." Queen Mystic nodded slightly as she said with a gentle but emotionless voice, "I know why you want to see me." Without waiting for Klein to say a word, she tilted her head slightly and looked at the vine swing beside her. She said in a tone as calm as a lake that had countless undercurrents beneath it, "I feel that he hasn't really perished completely." "Does that mean you believe that Emperor Roselle hasn't died completely? He lives somewhere in this world, with a chance for him to return."
Klein didn't expect to hear such a straightforward and sensational words right at the beginning of their conversation. Although he easily controlled his expression, he was somewhat at a loss for a reply. At the same time, he noticed that Bernadette referred to Emperor Roselle as he, instead of he. Regardless if they were using ancient Phasac to speak or the normal daily language used in Loan or Intis, they were completely different words. This means that deep down in Queen Mystic's heart, Emperor Roselle isn't an angel, but a father. Klein calmed down his emotions and deliberated before asking, "Why do you have such thoughts?" Bernadette retracted her gaze from the vine swing and said with the same gentle voice, "Towards the final stages of his life, although he was crazy and radical, everything he did had preparations in place. I believe that he must have prepared something for himself. You should know that he attempted to switch pathways in his later years and tried for the vacant Black Emperor throne. This required him to build 9 secret mausoleums in the form of pyramids. After he died in the White Maple Palace, the Churches of the Eternal Blazing Sun and Steam jointly found 8 mausoleums and destroyed each one of them. However, the 9th mausoleum remains to be discovered. No one knows where it's hidden. If he had already become Black Emperor, he can definitely awaken inside that mausoleum. If he fails, I believe that there's a possibility of using it for his resurrection." Bernadette's voice softened as she spoke. Towards the end, her voice was ethereal and nearly indiscernible. "You aren't that confident either. It's mostly a kind of hope and expectation." Klein sighed. Suddenly, he recalled the words by King of the Five Seas Nast. Emperor Roselle liked to stand in front of a particular floor-to-ceiling window and look to the west. From Roselle's diary, Klein knew that he had discovered the abyss's entrance in the fog sea west of Intis. There, he had found a primitive island and believed that it was filled with oddities and was worth exploring. Could it be that Emperor Roselle built the last secret mausoleum in the abyss or on that primitive island? Klein thought for a moment before smiling. "You seem to understand the Black Emperor pathway very well." He suspected that Emperor Roselle had left the Black Emperor card as a bookmark and had used Bernadette's name in ancient Phasac as the activation incantation because he partially wanted to inform his daughter of the corresponding ritual. In the end, Bernadette had seemingly grasped the information via other means. The lips behind Queen Mystic's fishnet veil produced a slight curl. "I've already investigated this matter for more than a century. And to figure out the details, I've suffered the infusion of knowledge from the hidden sage. I can tell that you, and Mr. Fool who's backing you, have a deep understanding of this. I've always been curious why you're so interested in his matters. From the current situation, and in terms of seniority, you could call me uncle. The Emperor and I might very well be roommates, who had been hung up for many years," Klein lampooned to relieve his emotional upheavals. However, he replied in a calm tone, "You can raise this question to Mr. Fool." He didn't plan on telling Bernadette that the 9th secret mausoleum might be somewhere in the Fog Sea, very likely to be on the primitive island, or in the abyss. It was more suitable for the Fool to answer the question. Queen Mystic wasn't surprised by Gairman Sparrow's response. She cast her gaze west to a certain spot far away. Although he couldn't see Bernadette's gaze, Klein could vaguely sense that this lady was looking at the place where she had her childhood. She was looking at her spiritual home, the home where she could no longer return to. At that moment, in the green vines and deep darkness, there were a lot of subtle emotions and dreams that hid deep in the heart, fermenting. In just a matter of seconds, Queen Mystic retracted her gaze and gently said, "After my matters in Backland ends, I'll pass a few pages to Katlia and get her to ask the question on my behalf. Why don't you ask next week?" Klein didn't hide his puzzlement. Bernadette calmly replied, "I feel that the answer will affect my mood, and a bad mood will result in my failure." A failure because of a bad mood. What sort of matter has such strict requirements? A clash with a demigod of the mind domain? Or perhaps, after she resolves the knots in her heart, will she have the confidence to attempt to become an angel? Klein nodded in thought without pressing. This was a secret of hers, something that it was best not to ask about unless necessary. Queen Mystic then said, "When he wrote those few diary pages, I was sitting opposite him. I wanted him to teach me how to interpret and write those symbols. He didn't agree to it and only ruffled my hair. Back then, I was already of age. I can tell that he was worried, apprehensive, and in a difficult position when he wrote those pages. Finally, he told me that if I can really become an important figure of the mysterious world as Zaratul predicted, I must make sure to remember, be careful of the spectator." Be careful of the spectator. Klein couldn't help but inwardly repeat Roselle's warning. He believed that the Emperor wouldn't be broadly referring to the beyonders of the spectator pathway. He was definitely pointing to a particular special existence, some special matter, or both. Emperor Roselle was a member of that ancient secret organization. That ancient secret organization's founder and leader is. Klein's eyelids twitched as he didn't dare to think any further, afraid that a particular existence would hear his thoughts. Perhaps there are detailed descriptions on that diary page, he said, hoping to see that diary page as soon as possible. I know. Bernadette nodded. She didn't continue on the topic. After 2 seconds of silence, she said, I should thank Mr. Fool and you on Catlia's behalf. Obtaining the blood of a snake of fate is very helpful towards her future. Although the advancement ritual of a mysticologist doesn't have any requirements on the mythical creature's pathway, the best choice is still the fate pathway. This will make it a lot easier for her when she advances to sequence 3. Why? Klein asked with the mindset of learning new knowledge. After all, it was impossible for a blessed to know everything. Even a true god was incapable of that. Bernadette's eyes turned slightly vacant. Another way to call prying into the secrets of fate is clairvoyance. The Mystery Prior's sequence 3 is called clairvoyant. This also why I'm in Backland. Due to a particular future prediction. Klein mused, having a guess and some level of enlightenment, many pathways seem to have the ability of clairvoyance. The corners of Queen Mystic's mouth curled up slightly as she sighed and said, in ancient times, many Beyonder creatures believed that gathering similar powers would lead to a qualitative change and breakthrough, but all of them went mad without exception or lost control. Only after the first blasphemy slate appeared did all creatures realize that balance, the kind of balance needed to walk on the edge of a cliff, was key to the path of extraordinariness. Therefore, a domain's powers can be scattered across many pathways, concentrating on a few main pathways while the other pathways share the remnants. A negative example is the King of the North from Groselle's Travels, Ulysses. Klein fell into a deep thought without pressing. After a while, Queen Mystic broke the silence. If you have nothing else, let's end it here today. Klein thought for a moment before saying, all right, if you need any help, you can find me through Admiral of Stars. Bernadette nodded gently as her figure suddenly turned transparent before turning into a cluster of bubbles. The bubbles scattered and flew off before vanishing immediately. The dark green pea vines retracted and vanished into the night. Klein seemed to be held by an invisible hand as he landed gently on the Backland Bridge. He reached out his hand to press his top hat and surveyed his surroundings. There were rows of houses lining the banks, emitting faint yellow lights. Amidst the gushing sound of the surging river and the darkness of the night, everything appeared serene, silent, warm, and peaceful. I hope none of this will be destroyed. Klein sighed as his figure quickly turned transparent and faded away. Dear Mr. Azek, ever since September was ushered in, Backland's temperature has been dropping day after day. Recently, the elderly can already be seen wearing gloves when outdoors. Just like last year, the smog has begun to envelop the city. This would happen 1 to 2 days a week, or even more. Clearly, the environmental measures governing air pollution aren't something that can be resolved in a year or two. It will take at least 5 years. Something that should be worth being happy about is that the pungent smell in the air has already lessened significantly. My sanguine friend is very pleased with such weather. Another delightful change is that more and more students, postmen, and technical workers have bought bikes. The number of carriages on the streets has decreased, implying that the smell of horse feces and the stench it brings is no longer the main pollutant in Backland's air. Of course, they still occupy a rather important position. As you know, those ladies and gentlemen who think highly of their standing wouldn't casually lower their own standards of one Lingyu. However, based on my observations, their kids are gradually having a growing interest in bikes. I've been leading a normal life during this period of time. I go to St. Samuel Cathedral and the Lowen Charity Bursary Foundation a few times a week, participating in their activities and continuously donating cash. I occasionally visit the Turf Club, watch plays and orchestras, or play cards or golf at the club. During weekends, I either participate in balls, banquets, or saloons. I forgot to mention that I've already bought a manor. It formerly belonged to Duke Negan and is called Mega. It has its own excellent vineyard and brewery, as well as a huge forest and plantation on it. It can be used for farming and hunting. Its main building has a huge rectangular shape with 4 stories. It has a large number of rooms, and a casual tour of the place without walking out the door would take me more than 10,000 steps. At the same time, it also has a large number of sculptures, oil paintings, decorations, and exquisite cutlery. It's simply palatial. Perhaps my description is a little exaggerated. After all, I've never seen a real palace. This is also the first manor that I own. I still remember my time in Tingen. I lived in a rental apartment with only 2 bedrooms with my brother and sister. Every day, we slept to the smell of coal. This was introduced to me by Brigadier General Connors Kilgore. It cost me £20,000. You don't have to worry about my financial situation. I made a huge sum of money from the southern continent, and I also sold some mystical items. Currently, I still have more than £17,000 in cash and £15,000 worth of gold bars, including various gold coins, soli, and pence. I'm rather satisfied with Mega and have sent my former valet, Richardson, to be the land steward. It's now autumn, and I'm going to invite guests to enjoy a pleasant weekend there. I hope Richardson can make adequate preparations. The mysterious world in Backland hasn't changed for now. I hope it will continue like this. The magic mirror I previously mentioned to you has been restored to normal. However, it seems to still suffer from post-traumatic stress due to the damage Eamon had dealt it. As long as I question it about what happened, it will automatically change the color of its text and give an erroneous answer and repeatedly request me to complement it. It also has different views on leaving the Church of Steam. It seems to have decided to stay a little longer, believing that it would be safer that way. It has even thought of showcasing its danger and become a Grade 1 sealed artifact. I have to say that I'm always surprised with the way it thinks. Thanks to some of its answers, I've found a way to create pure darkness. It is to create it with a charm of the Evernight domain that has Dreamworld properties. It's considered a response of the Evermight goddess and is categorized under pure darkness. In addition, after repeated tests, I finally figured out the way to carve the godhood symbols through cogitation and create the item I want. Upon writing this, Klein, who was sitting on the sofa while using his thigh as his table, stopped writing and rubbed his temples. Repeated failures implied the repeated loss of worms of spirit, and every separation was a damaging blow to his spirit body. It took him a long time to recover. Therefore, in order to have redundancies to prevent any accidents, Klein never pushed himself to the limit. After separating 3 or 4 worms of spirit, he would choose to rest for a few days before beginning the engraving process. Such breaks took him this long to master the method and create a finished product. Glancing at the rectangular diamond beside him, he saw layers of complicated symbols that extended into the void from the constantly refracting light. His head felt a little dizzy as though he was witnessing a part of history. I'll call it the yesterday once more charm. Klein retracted his gaze and continued writing. The coastal regions have had another storm brewing. The 2 houses of the kingdom have entered the traditional phase of debating over bills. With the footsteps of the new year approaching and getting louder, it makes me worried for some baffling reason. May you recover quickly and wake up soon. Your eternal student, Klein Moretti. Putting away the pen and folding the letter, Klein blew Azek's copper whistle and summoned the skeleton messenger that stood nearly 4 meters tall. Unlike before, this messenger had only shown its head and 1 arm. The rest were beneath the floorboards on the 2nd floor. This made it appear significantly shorter than Klein. After all, I'm now barely considered a blessed of death. Klein handed the letter to the messenger as he watched it crumble into bones, gushing down into the ground like a waterfall. After doing this, he picked up the yesterday once more charm on the armrest. This was his first successful product, and he planned on using it first. After all, making it again was easy now that he had the experience. As for whether borrowing strength from his historical self posed any dangers, Klein had already performed a divination above the grey fog ahead of time. He believed that if it involved the real fool or the owner of the Door of Light, then he would have the mysterious space above the grey fog to block it for him. And the result of the divination was that it was very safe. After staring at the diamond-like charm for a few seconds, Klein no longer hesitated. He opened his mouth and said a single word in ancient Hermes, history. He had attempted it in the real world and not above the grey fog because he was worried that the mysterious world would sever the connection to the past. Amidst the echoing of the jarring word, Klein injected his spirituality into the yesterday once more charm. Light that appeared like scattered fur lit up, illuminating the surroundings with bright and pure light. Vaguely, a scene flashed past Klein's eyes. It was him dancing leisurely with Daly Simone beside Ince Sangwill's corpse. It was the grey sideburned and exceedingly handsome Dwayne Dantes. It was Gairman Sparrow pressing down on his top hat while landing on the black tulip thanks to the blessings of the wind. It was the Sherlock Moriarty who struggled during the descent of the meteor. It was Klein Moretti who summoned sunlight when he heard the baby's cry in the Blackthorn Security Company. It was the pale university graduate who raised the revolver and aimed it at his temple. Beyond this, all the scenes vanished. All that was left was the greyish-white fog. And only when the powers of the charm were exhausted did Klein find himself at the end of that fog. Indeed, my transmigration is related to the grey fog, that mysterious space, and that strange door of light. This basically verifies it. I was sleeping in a cocoon in the past, hanging above the door of light. I've no idea how long I was in that state. Compared to his first time seeing the door of light, Klein, who had made the confirmation, remained calm as though he had long expected it. Phew. Next, I'll make 2 yesterday once more charms for Will. This charm isn't of much use to me. I won't be visiting him this week. It will incur suspicion if I feed him ice cream every week. Their maid is already looking at me in an odd way. Also, since I've mastered the cogitation engraving method of the godhood symbol, I can bring forward the creation of the extraordinary bullets made with the worms of time. Yes, Leonard said that he will be visiting Tingen in the next few days. Let's see if the power of the mutated sun's sacred emblem can be stolen. Klein rubbed his forehead and left the sofa. At a previous tarot gathering, Leonard had already informed him of the 4 types of godhood symbols and magical labels he learned from Palais Zoroast. They came from the Marauder domain, and it was said that one of them was capable of misdirecting the enemy, making them make errors in judgment. Another was to steal 3 Beyonder powers that the target had formerly used, beginning with the most recent power. The third would cause the enemy to lose plenty of vitality if the enemy could be affected by it, making them enter an aged state. Finally, one of them could create worms of time that didn't live long. They would secretly parasitize the target's body and allow the charm user to control them. Among the 7 remaining worms of time that Klein had, he had already made 3 into Fate Siphon charms and had given Miss Justice 1 and kept 2. This also meant that he still had 4 worms of time, allowing him to try out each of the 4 effects. Of course, his intuition told him that the chances of a successful product weren't guaranteed. As for Leonard's 2 worms of time, one had been made into a Fate Siphon charm. He had followed the World Gairman Sparrow's instructions to pray to Mr. Fool and had received a reply. The other relied on Palais Zoroast's help to create a parasite charm. After busying himself with a series of tasks, it was evening. Klein had 5 successes and 1 failure. He obtained 2 yesterday once more charms, 1 parasite bullet, a deceit bullet, and a deprivation bullet. The only failure was the aging bullet, seemingly due to the inability to use sufficient powers from the mysterious space above the grey fog. Looking at the 3 similar-looking bullets that were a mix of transparency or translucency, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He took out Death Knell and loaded the bullet. In the revolver were 3 of his control spirit bullets. After clearing the altar, he walked out of the room and headed for the 2nd floor. Upon entering the dining hall, he said to butler Walter, who was waiting for him, "Invite the guests to a hunting trip over the weekend in the city outskirts using the name list." "Yes, sir." Walter was already prepared for this, remaining stem and serious. Tingen City, 36 Sutherland Street. Leonard got off the carriage as he looked at a newly built building with a mixed expression. He momentarily forgot to enter. The 36 Sutherland Street of the past was just filled with a cement foundation, with each floor's 2 windows forming the shape of an arch with their covers being shut. It had the architectural traits of post-1300s of the 5th epoch, and the natural lighting wasn't very good. After its reconstruction, the bottom floor had a small sheltered porch with 2 oriel windows that extended to the 2nd floor. The thinner portion of the window frames had a wall and a decorative column that supported a thin stone beam. Above the oriel window was a parapet that connected straight to the 3rd floor. This was a 3-story architectural style that had been made popular in recent years. His thoughts seemingly going adrift, Leonard had a feeling that he had come to the wrong place. After falling into a daze for about 10 seconds, he stepped into 36 Sutherland Street with a silver inlaid cane. Following that, he walked up the stairs, turned around a bend, and saw the black door and vertical signboard, Blackthorn Security Company. When he arrived, he seemed to gradually find a sense of familiarity. He sped up his pace and pushed open the ajar door. A brown-haired girl who held the Tingen City Honest paper up vertically on the desk moved the papers to the side when she heard the unconcealed footsteps, revealing a smooth forehead, light brown eyes, and a pretty face. "Good afternoon, Roseanne," Leonard greeted somewhat hesitantly. Roseanne first wore a look of surprise before her expression fell. She said in an abnormally cold tone, "Good afternoon. Congratulations on avenging Captain and Klein." Leonard widened his mouth, at a loss for a response. He didn't even press down on his top hat despite his dislike of wearing hats. He forced a smile and nodded slightly. Then, he went forward in silence, passing Roseanne, planning to enter the door beyond the partition. Just as he was about to enter the office, he suddenly heard Roseanne say rather softly behind him, "Live well?" Leonard slowed down his pace slightly before nodding his head heavily. When he entered the interior, he instantly saw Fry standing by the captain's office. This corpse collector still had a paleness that resulted from not being under the sun for a long while. He had black hair and blue eyes, a high nose bridge, and very thin lips. He had a cold and dark demeanor. Leonard solemnly looked at him for a few seconds before exhaling, trying hard to coolly smile. "Long time no see." "Good afternoon, long time no see." Fry pointed to the captain's office. "I've already received the telegram and know of your request. I'll get 2 team members to carry out the operation with you. Also, you need to fill in a sealed artifact request form." Slightly surprised, Leonard said with a smile, "You're the captain now. You aren't as silent as before." Leonard had actually finished digesting his Soul Assura potion and could advance to Sequence 5 Spirit Warlock, but to obtain the power of that drop of the eternal blazing sun's blood, he deliberately kept it a secret. He continued placating the souls around Backland and finally, through his hard work, found an opportunity to come to Tingen. "Yes," Fry said with a gentle nod. "Actually, I don't like to speak much, but I have to do so as the captain." Leonard nodded slightly. "When did you become a captain? Why haven't I heard of it?" "Recently," Fry succinctly replied before giving an explanation. "Shortly after you left, I became a Sequence 8 Gravedigger. I finally advanced to Spirit Medium last month. And it just so happened that the previous captain was transferred away." "That's fast." Before Leonard could finish his sentence, he had punched himself in the head. "Look at my memory. I forgot that Klein had already shared some experiences with everyone." He lowered his right hand and said to Fry with a smile, "In that case, you still have room and time to make further progress. Perhaps you might become a deacon." Fry shot a look at him and retracted his gaze. "I'll likely not choose to continue advancing." "Why?" Leonard took a few steps out and came to Fry's side, asking in puzzlement. Fry looked up at the ceiling and said in a calm and heavy voice, "I wish to stay here. Protecting this place, always." Leonard fell silent and didn't give a response. He observed his surroundings and felt that there were quite significant changes, but there were also many things that remained immutable. Fry fell silent for a while before saying, "I'll dispatch 2 members to follow you." As he spoke, he headed for the basement. Leonard then subconsciously followed by the side. The office right at the bottom had its door open. A few Nighthawks were in there playing cards, fighting evil. When they sensed their captain approaching, they hurriedly put down the poker cards and stood up. Leonard swept his gaze across them and saw 2 familiar faces. They were Royale, with her smooth black hair, and the white-haired, black-eyed Seeker. At the same time, he also saw a few unfamiliar faces. He saw the pence, Soli, and poker cards on the table. For a moment, he felt his mind adrift as his vision blurred up. In the Rorstad archipelago waters, in a small harbor neighboring a fishing village, at the bottom of the future. Frank Lee rolled up his sleeves and crossed his arms, seriously looking at the mushroom in front of him. The mushroom, together with its cap, stood at a height of 1.8 meters tall. Its white surface had a few bright red spots that resembled eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Apart from that, its stem had protruding spores. They had thick and strong-looking white hyphae that resembled tentacles. Frank sized up this gigantic mushroom and surveyed the area, looking at the wooden walls, floorboards, and the mushrooms of different shapes and sizes before saying to Artisan Seelf, "Not bad. This experiment has made progress again. This mushroom has a strong inclination to reproduce, and this will make it hungry, making it eager to replenish itself with monster flesh and blood. Be it roasting or boiling, these can cease its activity, making it not as dangerous." How does it taste? Didn't you try it? The offspring that it produces have random flavors: beef, fish, and malt. Some are even filled with milk. One of them is enough to satisfy any requirements for breakfast. See, the crew no longer enjoy drinking anymore. There are mushrooms that can be plucked everywhere. I believe that when out in the wilderness, to fill one's stomach, one has to carry dry rations and hunt wild beasts. That's just too troublesome. If we can let our bodies grow mushrooms, wouldn't it save the hassle? Artisan Sea Elf was a lot thinner than back when he was in Biome. His eye sockets were deep and his eyes vacant. They were lacking in life. Upon hearing Frank's words, he seemed to recall something as his body trembled. He silently crouched down and opened his mouth, producing retching noises. Are you okay? I know it was tough on you. I'm really grateful for all you've done recently, Frank said sincerely to the artisan. If it wasn't for you, the mushrooms wouldn't have such a strong inclination towards reproduction. Also, they have obtained abnormally strong vitality under the moonlight, allowing themselves to purify themselves. This effectively eliminated the poison that accumulates from devouring monsters. The only problem is that there's no moonlight in pure darkness. This is the next problem that we need to resolve. Sea Elf didn't say a word. After he finished vomiting, he immediately stood up and turned to rush outside. However, a thick and strong white heifer reached out and pulled him back. I'll return my mystical items to me. I want to die with these mushrooms, he yelled frantically, his voice softening as his mouth was covered. At this moment, green vines rapidly retreated from a certain spot of the fishing village, as though it was growing in reverse. Katlia walked out of it, her eyes dark purple with some silver hints to them. Her ears continued resounding with the illusory ravings of the hidden sage, however, she no longer found it terrifying. She didn't find it unacceptable like before. Wherever she looked, there were countless indescribable figures looking as if they were shadows stacked upon each other, like an invisible gaze that was cast over from an unknown location. Compared to the past, she could already see the unknown existence hidden behind the curtains. She could see the moons high up in the sky that were of different colors. They were either blood red, silver, dark brown, or ghostly blue, resembling eyes that looked down upon the land. Katlia's mind hummed as she hurriedly retracted her gaze, afraid to look further. She had already dissected the snake of fate's blood and completed the ritual. Through that, she had obtained godhood, becoming a Sequence 4 mysticologist of the Mystery Prior pathway. However, she remembered the Queen's warning: among all the Sequence 4 Beyonders of the 22 pathways, mysticologist was the job that encountered danger the easiest. It was because they often saw things that they shouldn't see, hear things they shouldn't hear, and be aware of secrets they shouldn't be aware of. Therefore, a mysticologist needed to know how to curb their curiosity and control their respective actions in order to live long. Removing the heavy glasses she hung on her clothes, Katlia wore it, but all the various things she saw in the real world didn't vanish. She curled her lips in satisfaction in a self-deprecating manner. She knew that the item could no longer seal her ability of prying into secrets. She closed her eyes before opening them. Her eyes had turned black, no longer having the mysterious dark purple and silver hues. Phew! Katlia heaved a sigh of relief and slowly walked to the future as though she had simply gone out for a stroll. She didn't wish to announce her becoming a demigod, and she had no intention of quickly becoming the fifth royal over the seas. To her, this was a trump card in this dangerous world, one that she had to keep close to her chest. South of the bridge, Rose Street. The carriage that Emlyn was on drove down the street when he saw the blurry figure in a white shirt and black vest with slightly messy hair appear opposite him. It was that wraith-like young man. "Long time no see, Mr. Marich," Emlyn said with an unsurprised smile. Marich nodded slightly. "I'm here to tell you that we've already made the preparations. We can discuss the actual operation. Report chapter." "All right," Emlyn replied very calmly. Marie didn't speak further as his figure vanished. He knew that it was impossible to come up with a specific plan in an instant. Emlyn White had to first seek the opinion of the upper echelons of the Sanguine, therefore, he didn't stay. "This might be a chance for me to obtain godhood and become an earl." Emlyn smiled as he watched the wraith, Marie, leave silently. He had yet to digest the Scarlet Scholar beyond a characteristic. The so-called opportunity to become an earl referred to the promise of obtaining a free ritual and the corresponding potion formula. The carriage continued forward and stopped at the entrance of the Harvest Church. Emlyn looked at the greyish-white fog in the sky with a look of satisfaction, pressed down on his silk top hat, and unhurriedly alighted the carriage before entering the cathedral's door. After changing into his brown priest robe, he picked up a cloth and a pail of water and began seriously wiping the surface of the candle stands. After Father Utreski, who appeared taller, finished his morning sermon, Emlyn stopped working and grumbled, why was Ernst allowed to return? He only requested to do a month of volunteer work. Father Utreski wasn't annoyed by Emlyn's repeated question from time to time, appearing extremely patient. Upon thinking of his encounter, Emlyn immediately felt indignant. He couldn't help but mumble, he was forced to do volunteer work, not out of his own accord. He can't be allowed to decide on the period. He needs to serve at least half a year. Father Utreski replied with a smile, he did well. He worked hard the entire month, guiding the devotees and copying the Bible. I could clearly sense that he had already realized the value of life and the joy of the harvest. Emlyn's facial muscles twitched slightly. Is he also? No. Is he soon going to become a believer of Earth Mother? No, I didn't force him to change his faith, Father Utreski said gently. I only taught him the teachings of Earth Mother and to sense the traces and fragments that life brings. I hope that he will recall the home for the soul, the mother's embrace, whenever he feels lost. Emlyn's lips quivered, but he ultimately didn't say a word. He lowered his head and continued wiping. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough. Fors sat on a high back chair, her gaze focused on an empty glass bottle on the desk in front of her. She had finally digested the astrologer potion some time ago. Today, under Zio's watch, she had concocted the Asmon's brain and the ancient wraith's cursed item into the scribe potion. She mustered her courage and drank it. At this moment, she felt her brain rapidly expanding. The grand folds and white matter rapidly increased as her body gradually blurred, separating into individual cells. Those cells formed a haloed door that circled her brain. Fors subtly heard the familiar ravings, but they were indistinct and blurry, preventing her from identifying the exact words at all. To the experienced her, it didn't affect her in any way. After an unknown period of time, Fors finally regained control over her brain and cells and could sense her body's existence. Almost at the same time, a large amount of knowledge resonated in her mind, making her understand how to use the powers of a scribe. The mutated brain reproduced the beyonder powers used by the target before driving a portion of the vitalized cells to form corresponding symbols, patterns, and labels for complete storage. This was, I came, I saw, I record, which used one's soul as a pen and one's spirit body as the paper. At present, I can only record one beyonder power that has the influence of godhood. The higher the target sequence, the higher the chances of my failure. Even targeted at sequence 4, one might not be able to succeed even once in 10 attempts. I can record 8 sequence 5 and 6 beyonder powers, and the effects are half of the original. I can record 20 sequence 7 to sequence 9 beyonder powers with their effects being almost like the original. When the potion is digested further, I'll enjoy an enhancement in all these aspects. Fors concluded the knowledge and her experiences before silently muttering to herself. This appeared to overlap with Leymano's travels, but Fors felt that no one would ever find having too many beyonder powers being excessive. Besides, the two were complementary. After all, she could rent Leymano's travels to other Tarot Club members and be paid with beyonder powers. However, she was unable to rent herself out. At sequence 6, an apprentice finally has sufficient combat strength. Fors reined in her thoughts as she sighed to Zio. She then took a pen and paper and began writing a letter. Dear teacher, I'm very pleased to inform you that I've finally become a scribe. I'm just one step away from my dreams of traveling. After writing a few sentences, she saw Zio stand up and walk towards the door from the corner of her eye. She hurriedly shouted at her, "Hey, shouldn't we head to a restaurant to celebrate?" Zio replied in a stern manner, "Your overflowing spirituality is rather serious. You'll need several days of cogitation to keep it under control. You aren't allowed to smoke or drink. Don't overly indulge yourself in your emotions." After the advice, she added, "I still have commissions to do. I almost have enough to exchange for the judge formula." All right. Fors threw up her hands. After leaving the house, Zio unlocked the chains and got onto a bicycle specially created for youths. She then rode towards Hilston Borough. According to the intelligence she had previously obtained, Viscount Stratford had reserved lunch at a luxurious restaurant. Upon reaching the restaurant, Zio secured the bike to a street lamp and found a secluded corner to observe the people passing by. After an unknown period of time, a carriage drove through the thin fog. There was a coat of arms with a flower and 2 rings engraved on it. Zio's focus intensified as she watched the carriage stop at the restaurant's entrance. She then saw the grizzled Viscount Stratford, who was in his 40s, get off first. He then extended his hand to the passenger behind him like a gentleman. It was a lady draped in a dark red cloak. Zio couldn't see the lady's face and only noticed that the lady's jaw was soft and her skin fair. On the Blue Avenger at the northern Sonya Sea, Alger Wilson's feet left the ground as he floated behind the window of the captain's cabin. He stared at the deck and distant waves outside. Having already digested a portion of the Ocean Songster potion, he had reported to the Church of Storms 2 weeks ago and had accumulated enough contribution points to obtain a wind-blessed potion and successfully consumed it. This also meant that he was officially a Sequence 6. Of course, he had to redigest the wind-blessed potion, but that wasn't too difficult. The biggest problem is that the commotion created from digesting the Ocean Songster is too obvious. I should have bought that Word of the Sea and blamed the singing on it every time. Alger sighed silently, but he didn't feel too much regret. This was because even if he wanted to buy it back then, he didn't have the money for it. Furthermore, he had figured out the way to digest the Ocean Songster potion. I should be able to get the information soon and confirm who that Phazak Navy officer that Mr. Fool wishes to investigate is. Alger retracted his gaze and floated back to the desk where there was a brass sextant. At this moment, 2 sailors passed by the deck while belching. There seem to be sirens in these waters. I always hear their singing at night, one of the sailors said in uncertainty. His companion sneered. How is that possible? How can a siren sound so bad? It must be some noise produced by some sea monster. City of Silver, in the training field which wasn't as crowded compared to during daytime. A pile of blue ice was stacked there like a small mountain. Derek didn't bring his weapon with him as he stood empty-handed in front of the mountain of ice, piously praying, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. After chanting the honorific name and making his request, he looked at the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad, walk towards the ice blocks from afar. Colin, with 2 swords on his back, carried a bottle of light-emitting and hot golden liquid. He watched as Derek exerted his strength to enter the ice block and bury himself inside completely without leaving a single crack. A deep and hazy darkness descended. Even with the lightning streaking across the sky, it was unable to illuminate the interior. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable surge appeared as though pairs of eyes were cast over from the depths of the darkness. Colin Iliad could clearly sense that Derek was in a deep slumber. Even though Derek was being frozen in ice that normally didn't melt and his body was trembling, he didn't wake up. Without any hesitation, he threw the potion bottle ahead of him. A wraith-like transparent figure floated above and enveloped it. This figure passed through the blue ice and came to the cramped space where Derek was. It took out the potion and placed it by Derek's mouth. Just as this action was done, it immediately retreated and left the ice blocks. Whoosh! Colin Iliad suddenly drew his sword and cleaved behind him to his right. A monster, whose rotting body was covered in eyes, burst out into yellow pus. It wasn't known where it came from. At this moment, Colin saw a radiant light emerge from the pile of blue ice. They scattered pure light, with a burning intensity, warmth, brightness, and vitality that was different from the surrounding lightning. This filled Colin's eyes as if the light had come from the Dark Ages. This City of Silver chief watched intently and was motionless for a long time until another monster emerged from the darkness. In the ancient palace above the fog. Little Sun is at sequence 5-2. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he cast his eyes at the crimson star representing the sun and cast it to another star. That signified Miss Justice. Over the past month or so, she had completed many of the Psychology Alchemist's missions and had exchanged her contribution for the Dreamwalker's potion formula. This also meant that she was about to meet Vin Rambus again. Backland, at the residence of the furniture merchant, Hampra. Audrey once again met the counselor of the Psychology Alchemists, Vin Rambus. This old gentleman remained warm and elegant, his white but lush hair was neatly combed. His blue, deep eyes seemed to contain infinite knowledge. Upon seeing him, Audrey's eyes wore a vacant look before she came to a realization. It was as though she had finally awoken from a long dream and recovered her lost memories. She wasn't surprised or puzzled by this at all, accepting this fact without any resistance as if it was something very normal. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rambus," Audrey greeted with the etiquette that was flawless. Rambus nodded slightly and replied with a smile, "Good afternoon, our girl." Over the past month or so, he had gradually adopted the idea that she was the pride of the Psychology Alchemists, and the most important girl. Audrey glanced at the diamond brooch at her chest and sat down with a smile, waiting for Vin Rambus to speak. In regard to the cue and guidance, she hadn't been affected at all due to her preparations. At that moment, when she heard Vin Rambus call her that, she wished to ignore everything, etiquette or whatnot, rolling her eyes without being afraid of being exposed. However, she ultimately held back without exposing any problems. Vin Rambus looked at Audrey for a few seconds before saying with the same smile, "You've done well during this period of time. As a reward, we've decided to give you the potion formula for Dreamwalker." As he spoke, he took out a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and placed it on the coffee table. He then pushed it towards the noble lady. Audrey pressed down on her skirt and got up slightly. She picked up the piece of paper and unfolded it in front of Vin Rambus. Her gaze first fell on the main ingredients before she quickly skimmed the ritual. Main ingredients: 1 Dreamcatcher's heart, 1 Mind Illusion crystal or a mature mind dragon's complete brain. Ritual: seek out a harpy in the spirit world and sign a contract with it. Then, holding 1 tail feather, consume the potion amidst intense feelings of either joy or anger. As though sensing Audrey's puzzlement, Vin Rambus explained with a smile, "A harpy has the ability to give nightmares. It can snap people awake from the dreams, so the entire ritual's essence is to be immersed in a dream and be unwilling to wake up from it. Get pulled out of the dream via an external force, or else you might sleep forever or lose control and turn into a monster." Audrey nodded in thought. "The requirement to consume the potion amidst intense feelings is to prevent myself from sleeping too soundly and deeply." "Yes, you've already grasped the crux of the matter," Vin Rambus said with a smile. "If you don't know much about the spirit world and can't find a harpy, we can provide some help. If the ritual's essence is for me to wake up from a dream, that means that the harpy isn't necessary. The blessings of Mr. Fool's Angel can allow me to remain lucid in dreams. I can wake up whenever I want." Audrey's green eyes darted about and said with looks of anticipation, "I can try it myself first." "All right." Vin didn't mind the girl's desire to take risks. He paused and said, "I have another matter for you. If you do it well, we will provide you with all the ingredients of the Dreamwalker potion." "What is it?" Audrey asked without any resistance, just like before. Vin Rambus said with a slightly solemn expression, "Find out the attitudes of your father, Earl Hall, the present Duke Negan, Admiral Amirius, and the other nobles about a relatively major war." War. Audrey repeated the word that she had often heard but found somewhat unfamiliar. She had a vague feeling that ripples had suddenly formed under the surface of a seemingly calm lake. War. Above the grey fog, Klein listened to Miss Justice's prayer and fell into deep thought. He was unable to determine whether the psychology alchemists, Hermes, or maybe even Adam, who was lurking behind them, welcomed or objected to a war. As for whether the Loan King, the Prime Minister, and a number of nobles and the members of parliaments wanted war, the answer was relatively clear. Last year, the Hanged Man had once asked Miss Justice a similar question. Her answer was that the King and Prime Minister had the tendencies of being warmongers, but they had chosen to first focus on internal reforms and settle the connections over various matters. Now, about a year had passed, and all the policies that had been implemented were on track. In other words, it was time to start a war to snatch back the interests which Loan had lost in East Balam. It's a revolutionary era. The strife between countries are intense, and once war begins, it's unlikely that it can be controlled. Furthermore, Adam, Amen, and the other kings of angels have appeared one after another, have already retrieved key items, or are seeking breakthroughs. A storm is about to descend on the mysterious world, and danger is lurking. Klein sighed and returned to the real world. The next day, he first went to St. Samuel Cathedral to pray according to his schedule and donated tens of pounds. Following that, he went to 22 Phelps Street, planning to participate in some of the business of the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation. The moment he stepped inside, Klein saw Miss Audrey Hall and a few of the foundation staff coming down the stairs and walking towards the door. This noble lady was dressed very simply today. Her hair was tied up into a simple bun, and she wore no other accessories. Her dress was light green in color, and her sleeves had a circle of frills. There were no laces or tassels. "Good morning, Miss Audrey." Klein took off his hat as usual and bowed. He then nodded at the staff and greeted them. After Audrey responded, Klein casually asked, "Where are you going?" He knew that Miss Justice's main role in the foundation was to seek donations from the various ladies and gentlemen in high society. Audrey replied with a faint smile, "Visit the various universities and show some concern to the students we helped previously." Having said that, she blinked her eyes as her smile widened. "Mr. Dantes, do you want to go together?" Take a look at the children who had the chance of changing their fates due to your ideas and kindness. Oh, some of them are already young adults. Although Klein had never thought of obtaining anything in return from the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation, he truly wished that these actions could help the target group. Therefore, he was rather concerned about the progress and the actual situation. He nodded with a smile after some hesitation. I have no way of rejecting such an invitation. The group went out the door, and under Miss Audrey's suggestion, they chose an untracked public carriage. After getting into the carriage, Klein, in a gentlemanly-like manner, let Miss Audrey sit down first. Then, he sat opposite her and asked with a smile, "You seem to be very used to it." Audrey looked at the foundation staff beside her and said with a smile, "It's not the first time. It's impossible for us to take my own carriage every time we head out. They have to use public transportation." Upon saying that, she blushed in embarrassment and said, "The first time I was on a public carriage, I took out notes with £1 face value. The lady who collected the money got me to buy a few copies of newspapers before going back to her. Oh, it's cleaner than I imagined. The smell of the air isn't that unbearable either." Klein nodded slightly and said, "This is because the truly poor are unable to take public transport like this. They'd rather walk. Under normal circumstances, they don't have to head out, nor do they go somewhere too far. Mr. Dantes, you seem to be familiar with such matters." Although Audrey had guessed the reason, she still asked in front of others. Klein smiled. "Although I've never experienced it directly, I've seen too much of it." Audrey didn't continue on the topic. Instead, she mentioned to the beneficiaries that they were visiting to confirm their education and living conditions. Amidst their idle chat, they arrived at their first destination, Backland University of Technology. Based on Audrey's identity and Dwayne Dantes' social relations, they met the chancellor of the newly established university directly. He was a resident of 100 Bockland Street, Mr. Portland Moment. This elder had a large build, a ruddy complexion, and a loud voice. Whenever he talked to his neighbor, Dwayne Dantes, and the distinguished Miss Audrey about the university's establishment, he would complain about the Higher Education Commission from time to time. Audrey and Klein listened with a decent smile and occasionally echoed his words. Finally, they found an opportunity to raise the need to begin work. Portland was just about to get his secretary when he suddenly heard someone knock on his office door. "Please come in," the chancellor said loudly. The door opened without a sound. A black-haired, brown-eyed girl entered. She didn't doll herself up and was rather thin. She had nice facial features, and she looked to be 17 or 18. Klein's gaze suddenly deepened before he reined it in. The girl hadn't expected the chancellor's office to have guests. In her anxiety, she hurriedly lowered her head and said, "I'm sorry." "It's fine. They were about to leave anyway," Portland said without minding it. "Have you finished the item I got you to make last week?" Yes. The girl walked through the door and stood to the side. Portland Moment then smiled at Dwayne Dantes and Audrey. "Her name is Melissa Moretti. She's very talented with machinery. I happened to chance upon her and got her to help in my laboratory. Of course, she can only do some miscellaneous chores for now." "Not bad." The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he commended her with an obvious smile. Audrey glanced at him and smiled. There are always arrogant people who say that women have no talent in machinery, and this lady has proven them wrong. Portland laughed and shook his head. "There's no need to bother about such comments. All right, I'll get my secretary to help you in understanding the conditions of those beneficiaries." Audrey and Klein didn't stay any longer as they left the office. Once they were out the door, Audrey stole a glance at Dwayne Dantes, but she didn't say a word. 160 Bockland Street, inside Dwayne Dantes' mansion. Klein stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching as the rain began to descend along with the wind. The rain hit the ground and the glass, intersecting to form a mesh. Ever since autumn, Backland had started to rain again. It brought with it a lingering coldness and humidity. Klein stood there motionless for a long time, watching silently into the distance through the blurry rainy scene, his eyes unfocused. Only when his spiritual perception was triggered did he stop his wandering thoughts and turned his head to the side. Rionette, with the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in her hand, had a letter as she walked out of the void. "Who is it from this time?" Klein asked Miss Messenger out of habit. The last letter he received came from Sharon. The lady had told him that she had successfully completed the ritual and advanced to sequence 4 puppet of the prisoner pathway. Klein first sincerely congratulated her and apologetically informed her that he had already obtained what he needed and didn't need to visit Calderon City in the spirit world anytime soon. Of course, he also indicated that there was a huge secret there that might have something to do with him. He would probably head there one day, and when that time came, if Miss Sharon had the time or was willing, he wished to obtain her support. For Klein, on the one hand, he might have to head there to find the future ingredients he needed for his advancement. On the other hand, he believed that the magical city that involved ancient death, Phoenix ancestor Greggrace, also might contain the method to heal Mr. Azek's incomplete spirit bodies. Even if this death consul didn't have the means to advance, he hoped that by doing so, the former didn't need to repeatedly suffer the torment of losing his memories. Of course, Klein had prepared a plan for that. It was to wait until he advanced to Sequence 3 Scholar of Yore. He could prepare more yesterday once more charms for Mr. Azek, or he could imbue him with the corresponding Beyonder powers to speed up the recovery of his memories each time. At that moment, Klein had already received a letter. Rionette Tinniker's 4 heads replied one after another, from that undying idiot, Patrick Bryan of the Numinous Episcopate's Artificial Death faction. Klein easily understood who Miss Messenger was referring to. This was because Patrick was the one who wrote the most to him over the past 2 months. He reported almost anything of slight importance and asked for instructions. After a few times, Rionette Tinniker gave him a nickname. Miss Messenger never showed interest in such matters before. I wonder when it began. Most of the people who write to me have been given nicknames except Miss Sharon. As Klein silently mumbled, he unfurled the letter and gave it a quick scan. In the letter, Patrick Bryan said that the Southern Continent's orders were no longer about getting him to make various attempts to awaken death. Instead, they got him to prepare a special ritual and help the Death Domain Angel inside the mausoleum, Artificial Death Faction's leader, Hater, recover. It was to allow him to have the means to temporarily leave the land in which he sealed himself. Such an order didn't seem problematic on the surface, but it was a little sudden. However, Klein still sensed something amiss. The Artificial Death faction of the Numinous Episcopate in the Southern Continent had previously made Patrick continue the strange but dangerous rituals to awaken death. I managed to trick them by instructing him to use excuses such as the inability to gather the materials or the ultimate failure of the experiment. Now, they finally suspected that there's something wrong with Patrick. Klein nodded in thought. He suspected that this was a test directed at Patrick Bryan, a test that pointed towards an angel. An angel's response to rituals covered the entire world. Yes, it's good as long as they don't suspect there's a problem with artificial death. After all, they've inherited a huge inheritance from the ancient Balam Empire. Who knows if they have a way to affect the goddess's progress in controlling the death pathway's uniqueness. It could be a bane for both sides. Klein analyzed for a moment before heaving a sigh of relief. As for the test by the Death Domain Angel, he didn't think much of it. This was because the Fool could also direct power at the same level. With Angel's embrace, a disruption effect could be made. As long as the High Priest named Hater didn't descend in person and only exerted influence remotely, he could carry out misdirections in an ingenious manner. After figuring this out, Klein flicked his wrist, igniting Patrick Bryan's letter with scarlet flames. As he returned to his desk, he took out a pen and paper and wrote, "You may proceed according to your teacher's instructions, but before the actual ritual, you must report this to me and gain my permission." As the interval between the receiving and sending of letters was short, Patrick Bryan likely remained in his original spot. Klein didn't summon Patrick's messenger and instead blew the adventurer's harmonica and handed the folded letter to Rionette Tinniker. Amidst the drizzle, Zio draped a simple raincoat lined with tree sap over her and hid in the shadows, staring at the side door of Viscount Stratford's residence. It wasn't even evening, but the street lamps were already lit up. They emitted a faint glow in the rain. After a while, a rental carriage drove over from afar and stopped in front of the side door in a remote area. The Viscount's valet that had been hiding immediately ran out, opening an umbrella. He sheltered the cloaked woman down the carriage and quickly passed through the side door. As for the rental carriage, it remained in its spot without leaving. It had apparently been paid a sufficient amount of money. Zio still failed to see the woman's appearance, but she wasn't disheartened by it. She patiently waited in the cold rain as though she had turned into a motionless statue. She planned on attempting to tail the woman once she came out to confirm her identity. This was both an opportunity for her to obtain the Judge Potion formula, and it was also the reason why she came to Backland, to investigate the truth of her father's death. And it was because she was spurred by such motives that Zio had persisted in monitoring Viscount Stratford to this day. MI9's other intelligence officers had already ended the mission due to the lack of any developments over the previous few months. Even the Golden Masked Man who had designated the mission hadn't asked about this in weeks. Clearly, he didn't place any importance on it. Inside Viscount Stratford's bedroom, a beautiful brown-haired girl wore a silk gown and sat in front of a dressing table. She was fiddling with the skincare and makeup products as if she had discovered a treasure trove. Viscount Stratford, who was already middle-aged, wore a male nightgown and walked to the beautiful girl with his hair still moist. He smiled at her reflection in the mirror and said, "Charmaine, you no longer need those to add to your beauty. It's just a type of female instinct." The young girl named Charmaine raised her hand with a smile, pressing down on the Viscount's palm that had been placed on her shoulder. Viscount Stratford smiled gently and said, "When you touch them, you have a pure and innocent air to you. Hey, you make me discover my youth, like the days when I was only 18. Without waiting for Charmaine's reply, he continued, "My wife had already passed away for years. I always imagined I would live until the Lord beckons for me, but who knew that I would meet you? In a while, when the pressure accumulated in Backland is relieved, I will find a chance to walk down the wedding aisle to the altar with you." "Wedding? You want to marry me?" Charmaine was taken aback as she asked in disbelief. Viscount Stratford smiled and said, "Meeting you is a gift from the Lord. Although you aren't of noble birth, I've already married once. I don't have to consider such matters anymore. Of course, I'll think of means to raise your standing in society. Yes, I'll first find a merchant to recognize you as his illegitimate daughter." He droned on about his plan until he saw Charmaine's eyes filled with tears in the mirror's reflection. "The most precious thing about you is that you treat me 10 times better than how well I treat you, and you don't hide it." Viscount Stratford smiled as he lowered his head and kissed the top of Charmaine's head. Charmaine opened her mouth, seemingly crying and laughing. Only when the drizzle stopped and night fell did Zio finally wait for the woman in a dark red cloak walk out and board the carriage. After memorizing the carriage's traits, Zio tailed it from afar, using her beyond her powers as a sheriff and the empty streets at night to follow the target simply by walking or running. She went all the way from Empress Borough to the Backland Bridge area. Even with her stamina, she was almost at her limit, but thankfully, the carriage finally came to a stop. Zio brightened up as she switched her target from the carriage to the cloaked woman and continued tailing her. During this process, she was surprised that the woman had very good anti-tracking abilities. She would occasionally take detours and pause using obstacles. However, this didn't stump Zio, since she was already an experienced sheriff. She patiently tailed from afar without coming too close. Just as she sensed that the woman wasn't too far from her final destination and that she was finally about to catch up to her, she suddenly caught the scent of a sweet, ethereal fragrance. Zio's mind went into a daze amidst the fragrance before she completely lost track of her target. As for the fragrance, it had vanished as though it had never appeared. Zio's pupils widened slightly. She didn't dare to search her surroundings for any traces. Inside a rental apartment, Tracy, with a gentle and sweet face that made one unable to resist looking at her, looked at the mirror reflecting Charmaine and said, "You seem to be in a good mood. How was it? This final mission isn't too unacceptable, right? Once you complete it, you can leave Backland and start your own life." Charmaine was taken aback as her expression turned complicated as though she was disheartened. It was as though she had suddenly snapped out of her dreams. She didn't turn her head as her lips quivered while replying, "He said that he wishes to marry me." Tracy immediately pricked up her brows. "You mustn't believe a man's words during those times. You and I should know this very well. If he really wishes to marry you, he wouldn't be wary of you. He will wish to have a child with you." Hey, did he do so? Upon hearing her question, Charmaine's mood turned sullen. Tracy stood up and said with a smile, "I'm not stopping you from pursuing your love. If you wish to turn this temporary mission into a permanent one, you should think about what needs to be done." After ethereally finishing her sentence, she walked to the door and left the rented apartment. While heading down the staircase, Tracy suddenly noticed her shoes. She chuckled and said in a seemingly self-deprecating manner, "Love. Backland, Empress Borough, in the outskirts towards the northwest. This was a place that needed more than an hour via horse carriage. Mega Manor was built by the side of the Tussock River, so it had beautiful scenery around it with flourishing vegetation within its confines. Strangely enough, Backland's city areas had perennial rain with relatively few sunny days. However, in the outskirts, the clouds tended to be thin, and the sun was always bright. Despite the short distance, the two places had completely different weather. It was most obvious within the northwestern outskirts. It was even a rather famous grape plantation in the northern continent. And by following the Tussock River from this region northwest for another 50 kilometers, one would again encounter weather similar to Backland's city area. Such situations left meteorologists puzzled. They couldn't find any suitable theories to explain the reason. However, Klein had a vague guess. In the Fourth Epoch, this was the capital of the Tudor Tronsoist United Empire. It was also here that Blood Emperor Alista abandoned his humanity and became a crazy deity. Therefore, it was normal that the weather and terrain had changed forever in those very small confines. Leonard Mitchell had once mentioned information about this during one of the free exchanges. Furthermore, as an area with a long history and signs of early human activity, this Land of Hope buried countless ancient ruins. It was very possible that they could have an influence on the weather. The carriage drove into Mega Manor, passing by the fountain pond and small garden that was surrounded by the main building. Finally, it stopped outside the main door. Just as Klein got off the carriage with butler Walter, he saw the land steward, Richardson, led 2 rows of male and female servants by the door, awaiting their employer. Compared to 160 Bockland Street, there were more servants here, but they were mainly lower-class servants. Looking at Richardson wearing a spanking new suit, Klein nodded with a smile. Well done. Without waiting for Richardson to reply, he took off his hat and handed it along with his cane to his valet, Enony, while asking, "Have you prepared the activity room for the ladies to chat and for men to play cards in?" "Gun, yes, sir. I've placed poker cards, tarot cards, and some board games. The piano, violins and other common musical instruments have also been moved inside," Richardson answered eloquently. Klein passed through the door and nodded. "Where's the smoking room for the gentlemen?" "Like the ladies, it's all on the second floor. They're separated by 5 rooms." Richardson didn't need the servants in the manor to remind him. He didn't even need to recall to give an answer. To ensure that his employer's first hunting excursion was flawless, he had taken note of every nitty-gritty detail. Although it exhausted him physically, he was excited mentally. Klein asked about dinner and the guest rooms and confirmed that everything was in place. Before long, he received the first batch of guests after Mega Manor had a change of name, now known as Dante's Manor. Member of Parliament Mact and his family. "This place is much bigger than my Moose Manor." Mac took off his coat with a smile and handed it to a servant while praising, "I've always heard of Mega's wine being of excellent quality, but I've never had the chance of tasting it. I can finally have my curiosity satisfied today. I hope you won't be disappointed." Klein smiled modestly. As a famous area for grape plantations in the northern continent, champagne, red wine, and white wine were considered the finest in Backland's northwestern outskirts. But with the manor here mainly owned by the nobles, self-brewed alcoholic beverages were typically not sold to the public. Therefore, it was almost unheard of. Only people from high society or those related to them would know of this. Mega was one of the most iconic manors. The wine that it brewed was widely praised by people in the know. Red wine of certain years was even offered at more than £100 a bottle by collectors. However, for Klein to be able to buy this manor for £20,000, he naturally had to agree to certain conditions. All the wine from certain years were to be taken away by Duke Negan's servants. Mact was rather clear about this and didn't expect to drink famous wine commodities. He said with a laugh, "You can open a few bottles and pour a small glass of each for me. Let me decide which of the remaining wine is most spectacular." As a member of high society, he had never tasted the wine of Mega Manor. The reason was simple: he was a member of the new party, and the previous owner, Duke Negan, was the main sponsor of the Conservative Party. "No problem," Klein immediately agreed as his gaze swept across Hazel's face. Compared to July and August, this girl had clearly cheered up. She no longer felt apprehensive when facing strangers. Previously, it was as bad as not willing to participate in any banquets or balls. This made those familiar with her think she was sick. And this was all thanks to Audrey. Whenever she met Dwayne Dantes at the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation, she had mentioned that she had recently met Miss Hazel Mack twice. Such communication didn't seem problematic at first glance since Hazel was a common acquaintance of Audrey and Dantes. Finding a topic about a common friend was common in idle chatter. However, Klein could read Miss Justice's hints and understood that she had met Hazel twice at different balls and banquets and had treated her twice. After getting Mac's family settled in, Klein welcomed the second batch of guests for the weekend hunting trip, Brigadier General Conas Kilgore, who had come with a friend that he had previously mentioned. Klein knew this friend, but he didn't know Dwayne Dantes. He was a steam car mogul, Framis Cage. He was one of the main investors of the bicycle project. He had relied on a lawyer suspected to be a Beyonder with the lawyer sequence and had bought the 10% shares from Sherlock Moriarty at a cheap price. Since he's related to a lawyer, it can be explained how he's an Earl of the Fallen's friend. Klein went forward with a smile and hugged Brigadier General Conas and Framis Cage. "Welcome." He then stepped back and said to the portly, light blue-eyed Framis, who was a quarter Fazak, "I heard your steam car is very famous. Why didn't you drive it over?" Before Framis could answer, the manly Conas Kilgore said with a smile, "No, you don't understand him. He will never give up the chance to showcase his steam car. However, the car's too heavy. On the way here, it fell into a ditch and couldn't be pulled out. Thankfully, I never believed his claims and rode on a carriage myself, following behind him. Otherwise, he would have had to cover the remaining distance on foot. The main problem is that our roads are terrible. They need to be renovated and rebuilt. They need metal tracks to be paved, just like steam locomotives." Framis retorted and threw his hands up. "I was planning on seeking some investments from you. Haha, we can talk about it later. You were the one who invested in us previously, but now you're asking me for an investment." Only then did Klein realize that he was a rather famous tycoon in the upper class of the kingdom. He had donated shares worth more than £10,000 and had purchased an expensive manor. He had also established connections with the military, so it was obvious he was rich. "But in fact, my current net worth is only 50 to 60,000 gold pounds, perhaps a tenth of Miss Justice's wealth. I wonder when I can really become a tycoon with a net worth of £1 million. Klein thought in a self-deprecating manner. After some thought, he said, "It's fine. I'm very interested in the fusion of machinery and steam. When I'm free, I can take a look at your steam car." "Spectacular," Framis immediately said with a smile. "If I didn't know that you had donated a large sum to the Church of Evernite, I might even think of you as a believer of the god of steam. I've drawn the triangular sacred emblem on my chest in the past after all." Klein didn't continue on this topic, afraid that Conas would discover his intentions. He pointed to the staircase and said, "Why don't you head to the smoking room to try some of the prized cigar collections here? It wasn't until I bought this manor that I learned that there was a room specially for storing cigars. Its temperature and humidity are maintained, but as you know, I can smoke, but I don't like it." "Not bad. Do you have chieftain?" Conas Kilgore's face suffused a smile. "Of course." Klein gave a positive answer. There was only one goal in organizing this hunting trip. It was to hunt this Brigadier General, Deputy Director of Mi-9. Therefore, he had taken into consideration all his preferences. However, Klein wasn't in a hurry to take action for this hunting trip. This was because he still lacked an understanding of Conas Kilgore's actual strength as a hidden demigod. He needed more gatherings and hunts to figure out his preferences, level of alertness, and the items he brought with him. As a magician, Klein didn't perform unprepared. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough, Force put down the book in her hand and looked at Zio, who was pacing around the activity room. She couldn't help but ask, "What are you troubled about?" Zio shot her a glance and said, "I'm frustrated over whether to inform MI9 about Viscount Stratford's close relationship with an unknown woman, or to keep it from them until there's further development." "Why are you keeping it from them?" Force first asked in return before giving her answer. "Viscount Stratford is related to your father's death, but you normally lack the opportunity or strength to confront him, afraid of being exposed and affecting your mother and brother. And now, he might encounter an accident because of that unknown woman. He's in a relatively easy to deal with state. This is your opportunity, so you're being hesitant, right?" Zio fell silent for a moment before saying, "Yes." Force closed the book, stared at her friend, and said in a serious manner, "Since you're hesitating, it means you're already inclined towards one option." Zio slowly nodded and said, "Yes." Force fondled her slightly long curly hair and stood up, extending her right hand, and said, "I already know your decision." "Well, do you need help?" Seeing Zio hesitant to give an answer, she laughed and said, "I'm a Sequence 6 Beyonder." Without waiting for Zio to answer, she looked around. "If you're worried, we can still seek additional help." She was implying that they could get help from the members of the Tarot Club. Zio thought about it and exhaled. "Not for now. Let's try it first." Let's head out now and continue monitoring Viscount Stratford. Now, Fawes was taken aback. All right. But before that, let me use the crystal ball to do some astromancy to confirm the level of danger. After some work, she held the pure crystal ball in one hand and said, "There's a certain level of danger. Empress Borough, by the side of Viscount Stratford's mansion." Fawes and Zio, who were dressed in black dresses, hid in a dark corner. They stared intently at the tightly closed metal gates as they patiently waited for their target to appear. It wasn't raining tonight, so they didn't have to face harsh weather conditions. The carriage that remained parked by the side of the street lamps made it clear to them that their patience would be rewarded. It was only a matter of time. After an unknown period of time, the gates produced a heavy metal groan as they slowly opened. A figure in a black cloak appeared with its head bowed. The figure walked to the side of the carriage and nimbly boarded the carriage. "Is that her?" Fawes lowered her voice and asked Zio. She didn't have beyonder powers that could restore a target's characteristics from a mere description, and she had never seen her before. Therefore, she couldn't rely on her spiritual intuition or astromancy to make a judgment. Zio nodded in affirmation and said, "Yes." As they quietly conversed, the rental carriage sped up and left the side gates. Zio immediately left her hiding spot, prepared to use her sheriff's beyonder powers and the physical enhancement that being an interrogator gave her to lock onto her target while jogging. "What are you doing?" At that moment, Fawes pressed down on her shoulder, foiling her plans. "Track her." Zio looked back at her friend in puzzlement. Fawes looked at the rental carriage that hadn't completely pulled away from them and asked thoughtfully, "Why are you tracking her for? Also, didn't you say that the target has a rather powerful beyonder protecting her once you enter the Backland Bridge area?" "That's right." Zio first answered the second question before saying, "Your question is very odd. The reason you track someone is to determine the target's appearance, identity, and motives." Fawes retracted her left hand from Zio's shoulder and revealed a smile. "Since the target is protected by a rather powerful beyonder, it will be difficult for us to complete the tracking in the Backland Bridge area. We won't be able to find her residence and figure out her true identity. Do you wish to directly fight her guardian? Although you have me to help, are you certain about that person's strength? How certain are you? Will it be very dangerous? Besides, once the battle begins, it will definitely alarm the target. This is the same as stopping the carriage midway and confronting her directly. It will foil your primary objective. It will alarm Viscount Stratford and prevent him from falling into a predicament that will offer you a chance to take action. If we do it, then there's a possibility of failure, but failure is certain if we do nothing." Zio emphasized that she knew the situation well. All she wanted was to make an attempt and find an opportunity midway. At this moment, the rental carriage had already turned into another street at the end of the road. Fawes watched the back of it gradually disappear as she shook her head and smiled. No. We need to change our way of thinking. We should first attempt to figure out the target's appearance. After daybreak, we can use her appearance to perform normal investigations in the Backland Bridge area and then obtain information from other channels." "Your choice of words is very professional," Zio said in thought. "Of course. I've written detective novels before," Fawes answered without any sense of modesty. "But how do I figure out what the target looks like without alerting her?" Zio raised the most critical question. Prepared, Fawes took out Leymano's travels and said with a smile, "Elementary. Using the psychological invisibility Miss Justice recorded." Although Audrey didn't encounter any situations that required her to use Leymano's travels, she had rented it thrice out of curiosity. She studied the uses and traits of the beyonder powers recorded, and she recorded her own beyonder powers into it. This included the rather useful psychological invisibility. As for her true identity, Zio and Fawes were increasingly certain of it, but they didn't directly ask or do any further investigations. That was the most basic form of respect towards other Tarot Club members. After hearing her friend's answer, Zio came to a realization and was instantly inspired. Fawes continued, "By using the beyonder powers on this page, you will be placed in the sensory blind spots of all surrounding creatures. They wouldn't be able to see you even if you were to jump around in front of them. That way, you can directly board the carriage and stand in front of the target, openly taking in her appearance and remember all her traits. Hey, I sometimes think that people who use psychological invisibility might end up being squashed to death by huge creatures that happen to walk past if they're unlucky. Don't make too much noise later. Don't speak to any nearby creatures, or else you will garner attention. Let psychological invisibility be dispelled automatically. Yeah. Zio nodded, then she raised another issue. How do I prevent the target from discovering the sudden opening of the carriage door while it's driving? Without waiting for Force's reply, she immediately pressed, did you record the door opening beyond a power? Guess. Force smiled as she handed Leymano's travels to her friend, telling her which pages psychological invisibility and door opening were on. With this in mind, Zio immediately ran amidst the shadows, chasing after the rental carriage. Before long, she saw her target. Her right hand immediately trembled as she made the bronze-green notebook reveal a yellowish-brown goatskin page. She slid her fingers gently, and Zio seemed to see countless rippling light appear on the surface of a deep lake spread outwards. When her vision returned to normal, she sped up and rushed to the side of the carriage. To ensure nothing went wrong, Zio didn't immediately take action. With a few wide strides, she overtook the horse. She then turned around as though she was crossing the road. However, the carriage driver didn't notice her, nor did he shout out to her or rein in the horse. After confirming the effects of psychological invisibility, she sped up and dodged the horse's galloping and came to the side of the carriage. After a brief observation, she flipped through Leymano's travels and revealed a white page covered with strange patterns and symbols. Then, she reached out her right hand and pressed it on the surface of the carriage. Her figure instantly turned transparent as she appeared inside. The woman in a black cloak was sitting diagonally opposite her as if she was in thought, staring at the glass window where Zio stood. However, she didn't notice the bounty hunter who had suddenly infiltrated. At such a close distance, even with her cloak lowered, Zio was able to see her face clearly. Furthermore, the woman wasn't as careful as she was while walking outside. Her every action appeared rather casual as the hood was only at her eyes. Instantly, her appearance was reflected in Zio's eyes, overlapping with a face that still had some male characteristics. This was beyond a power of a sheriff. Zio's eyes widened as she couldn't help but shout, Sherman. She could foresee that the woman who often entered Viscount Stratford's residence was rather beautiful, but she never expected the woman to be her friend, Sherman. He was once a young man. A man who wasn't considered androgynous now looked beautiful. He had the charm of a woman. At that moment, Zio couldn't help but size up Sherman. She couldn't associate her figure with the young man she used to know with each other. If it wasn't for her sheriff beyond her powers that allowed her to confirm that the person opposite her was Sherman, Zio definitely would have imagined that she had made a mistake. And even so, she still suspected whether the person wasn't Sherman and was instead Sherman's twin sister. Upon hearing the surprised question, Sherman realized that there was another person in the carriage at some point in time, someone familiar. Bounty hunter, Zio Derecha. Having already changed her name to Shermaine, she was first alarmed, but the words Trissy often mentioned instinctively appeared in her mind. You cannot meet people you used to know. Do you want your husband, your beloved, to know of your former state? Only by completely severing your connections can you be reborn, doing so in order to save yourself. Such words quickly flashed across Shermaine's mind as a terrifying thought emerged in her thoughts: kill her. This thought seemed to come from a demon in the abyss as it constantly whispered in Shermaine's ear as it resonated in her heart. Kill her. Kill this person who recognized you. Only by doing so can you truly escape the past and not lose the present. Kill her. Shermaine didn't answer Zio's question. Her left hand slowly clenched up while slightly trembling. Zio sensed the intense emotions running through the person opposite her and confirmed that it was Sherman. Immediately, she asked in concern, how did you become like this? Where have you been all this time? Did you encounter something? Were you hurt? Shermaine's lips quivered as her left fist relaxed a little. She said with a sobbing tone, I've already begun a new life. Don't disturb me again, all right? I don't want to lose everything I have now. I don't want to see people that I knew in the past. The more she spoke, the faster it became. It became obvious that it was a plea. Zio was taken aback for a few seconds before staring at Sherman. Pursing her lips, she said, okay. She didn't stay any longer and reached out to open the carriage window and jumped out. Shermaine silently watched this entire process and finally exhaled before she slumped into her seat like she had lost all her strength. It wasn't easy for her to control the demon in her heart. At this moment, she saw a figure rapidly outline itself out of thin air beside her. The figure wore a black, old-fashioned dress, but it didn't diminish her beauty and disposition. She sat there silently without a word, but it was impossible to not look at her. Demoness Trissy. Why didn't you kill her? Trissy asked with a smile, not revealing any gloominess. It was as like an idle chat where she would ask what she had drunk the previous night. She's one of the few people who didn't ostracize me. She even helped me. Charmaine replied in shock before frowning. Why are you here? Chrissy smiled and said, I'm protecting you. Without waiting for Charmaine's answer, she said, you seemed to be in a good mood when you came out. Charmaine recalled what had happened and bashfully said, maybe, perhaps, I have a chance of becoming a mother. As she spoke, she touched her stomach with her right hand. The corner of her lips couldn't help but curl. I feel him kicking me. Charmaine suddenly froze and blurted, how could it be so fast? She wasn't sure if she could get pregnant today. Upon seeing her reaction, Trissy smiled even more charmingly. How was it? Did you take a good look? Just as Fors left the street where Viscount Stratford's mansion was, she saw Zio walk out with a down and vacant expression. Zio nodded hesitantly. I did. Having said that, she seemed to come to her senses and said in shock, I know her. No, him. Him. Fors was confused. Zio habitually observed her surroundings before saying, he's Sherman. The Sherman I told you about. He actually became a woman. Fors was stunned as she subconsciously asked, were you mistaken? Could she be Sherman's sister? Zio firmly shook her head. No, she admitted it herself and even told me not to disturb her. She wants to bid farewell to her past. But, how did he become a woman? Fors's eyes darted around as she suddenly recalled something. She said in thought, it's not impossible either. There's a beyond a pathway that allows a man to become a woman at a certain stage. She recalled Miss Justice mentioning something similar during a free exchange session. Ah, really? Zio's widened as she asked in disbelief. Yes. Fors had already recalled the exact conditions as she gave a rather confident answer. This, Zio was momentarily unable to accept it, but she couldn't find a rebuttal. All she could do was ask, which pathway is it? Fors replied, Demoness. Ah, it's the assassin pathway. Demoness. Sherman actually became a demoness, Zio repeated to herself. Suddenly, her voice became louder. Could it be that she's being taken advantage of? No, I must warn her. Just as she said that, Zio turned around and ran with great strides in an attempt to catch up with the rental carriage again. However, she couldn't find the target after attempting to pursue it for a few blocks. Sherman and the carriage seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Zio gradually slowed down and finally stopped. She looked at the bustling streets ahead of her with a complicated expression. Behind her, Fors passed through a few walls and finally caught up to her. Gone, Zio whispered. Fors also cast her gaze forward and thoughtfully replied, we were discovered. Without waiting for Zio to speak, she turned around and sighed. Let's return and find another opportunity. Zio didn't take a step forward as she continued standing there. After a few seconds, she said under Fors's puzzled gaze, since they discovered a problem, will they speed up the plans ahead of time? It's possible. If they don't wish for their plans to be foiled, they might attempt one final strike tonight before we're prepared. Fors immediately agreed with Zio. Let's return to Viscount Stratford's place and hide in a more concealed spot. We'll continue monitoring it. Zio immediately nodded and replied without any hesitation, okay. In the dock area, inside a warehouse with plenty of goods. Charmaine was sitting on a dirty wooden crate. Her hands were crossed behind her back as her body had thin but firm spider webs coiled around her. She appeared as though she was encased in a transparent cocoon, unable to make a single sound. It's not a bad thing for you. Trissy stood in front of Charmaine with a pitch-black flame that resembled ink burning in her palm. At the very least, you can determine if he really loves you or is lying to you. Charmaine was angry and afraid. She desperately used her whimpers to express her wish, but Trissy was unmoved. She turned her flame-wielding palm around and pressed it into Charmaine's stomach. The flames seemed to have intelligence as they scattered like flowing water. Following that, they penetrated her skin and flesh in an attempt to drill inside. Trissy's smooth, black hair flared up in defiance of the laws of nature. They were being pulled by invisible hands as they extended out in every direction. It stained the surrounding air with a peculiar smell. The strands of hair thickened as they scattered into distinct strands. Beneath them, dark beams of light surged, bringing about curses and words. They flowed rapidly, fusing into the pitch-black flames. Upon entering Charmaine's stomach, they quickly vanished. Charmaine's face twitched uncontrollably, but she didn't feel any pain. It was as though it was purely on reflex. She soon calmed down as she saw Trissy's figure turn faint and gradually turn transparent until it vanished. Charmaine's pupils widened as she struggled again, but she was unable to break free from her restraints. She tried again and again like a flood was rising, centimeter by centimeter, inside the silent warehouse. After an unknown period of time, the door to the warehouse opened with a thud and slammed into the two sides of the wall. A figure staggered in. It was the middle-aged Viscount Stratford. He didn't wear his white wig like he always did while outside. This revealed his rather high receding hairline and rather messy black hair. The latter was stuck together as though it had been drenched by a storm and was air-dried. But in the past few hours, the clouds were thin and the crimson moon high in the sky. It hadn't rained at all. Drops of sweat dripped down Viscount Stratford's rather cut facial contours as there were countless black threads flowing beneath his skin. His body was slightly hunched, and his facial muscles were somewhat twisted. His eyes were filled with pain and concern. He surveyed the area and was delighted when he found Charmaine. However, he turned anxious as he charged over without much confidence. When Charmaine saw him enter the warehouse, her face lit up as though it was covered in a halo. She then revealed a worried and fearful expression as she attempted to shake her head frantically. However, her neck was held firmly by the spider webs that prevented her movement. She reeled in anxiety, to the point of tears flowing out of her eyes, drop after drop, crystalline and frail. Just as Viscount Stratford was about to reach her, a loud bang suddenly rang out between the two. It was as though there was an invisible wall that separated him from Charmaine, one that couldn't be surpassed. If you wish to break the curse and take her away, you have to answer my question without hiding anything. At this moment, a figure quickly appeared in a corner of the warehouse. Her facial features were charming, forming together into an abnormally sweet look. She resembled the lover that every young lad would fantasize about in his youth. She was none other than Demoness Tracy. Without waiting for Viscount Stratford's response, she raised her right hand and conjured a pitch-black flame. Viscount Stratford's face, hands, neck, and exposed skin instantly turned transparent as they protruded with blood vessels. And in every blood vessel, there was a black flame silently burning as it flowed silently. The pain in Viscount Stratford's eyes immediately reached a peak, but it vanished the next moment. His expression turned extremely cold as a gibing look appeared in his eyes. It was as though the one being cursed wasn't him, but Tracy, who was a distance away. Tracy, who was in the corner of the warehouse, suddenly burst into black flames. Dense, countless spider webs appeared, but they couldn't be lit up. In the blink of an eye, Tracy was like Charmaine, being sealed inside a transparent cocoon. She couldn't move or escape. In a ventilation vent high above the warehouse, a figure appeared. It was a woman whose age wasn't obvious. She wore a simple and sacred white robe. She had black hair, blue eyes, looking sweet and beautiful, giving off an indescribable charm. Katerina Pell. Tracy seemed to expend all her strength before she shouted a name. At this moment, Viscount Stratford grabbed at his body, pulling out an illusory doll covered in thick black flames. He glanced at Charmaine and smiled at Tracy. When it comes to matters related to life, I would never be careless. After that fellow, Sykes, died, I knew that it would be my turn one day. Hey, since you're hunting me, it means there are obviously others who wish to hunt you. We're very patient, afraid of scaring you away. We did nothing and waited until today. Also, your gift was pretty good. Upon hearing Viscount Stratford's words, Charmaine, who was still struggling out of habit, instantly stopped moving. Her expression turned blank. Her eyes widened, but there wasn't any focus. The look in her eyes seemed to sink deeper and deeper. Love, Tracy suddenly laughed, seemingly mocking herself. She wasn't nervous at all. Mega Manor. Night had fallen. After settling more than 20 guests and preparing the hunting trip the next day, Klein woke up not long after he fell asleep. His intuition had been triggered as a scene formed in his mind. Brigadier General Connors Kilgore, who was wearing a shirt and pants, had flown out of the guest room's window in secret. He landed outside in complete defiance of the laws of nature. I haven't even taken action. He came here for his own goals. With a thought, Klein controlled a cockroach outside and turned it into his marionette. He then used its eyes to observe the surroundings. Almost at the same time, Connors Kilgore appeared. After this demigod left Mega Manor, he immediately distorted the distance, and quickly arrived by the bank of the Tussock River. He prepared himself to cross it. The cockroach watched quietly without any reaction. He's heading for the south bank of the Tussock River. What does he want to do? Does he have the preference of hunting in the suburbs so that he can attempt to conceal such actions? He also introduced Mega Manor to me for this reason. Klein lay in bed and seriously analyzed Connus's actions. After the Mi-9 demigod stepped onto the south bank of the Tussock River, Klein suddenly recalled a matter. Back when he escaped the underground ruins where Ince Sangwil and company were, he appeared somewhere in the northwest of Backland. This was the south bank of the Tussock River, making it rather close to where Mega Manor was. As his thoughts raced, Klein suddenly switched positions with his valet, Enony, who was in the opposite room. And under a grapevine 150 meters from the manor's main building, a slowly crawling centipede suddenly stiffened before it relaxed. Almost at the same time, its body vanished from its location. Dwayne Dante in his blue and white checkered pajamas had appeared. Klein had swapped places with his marionette again. He decided to use this method to secretly tail Connors Kilgore and figure out where he was going or what he was planning on doing. Although he could only move 150 meters at a time, and it took 2 to 3 seconds in between moves, due to the process of turning the target into a marionette, this was more concealed compared to flaming jump or teleport. It made it difficult for Connors Kilgore to detect him. After all, he was dealing with a demigod. Even in domains where one's spiritual intuition wasn't the best, a demigod wasn't to be underestimated. By the same logic, Klein didn't rely on creeping hunger to hide in the shadows. This was because it was relatively slow even though it concealed him rather well. It was impossible for him to catch up to the demigod. Under the dark night sky, from Mega Manor to the south bank of the Tussock River, the rats, snakes, spiders, fish that were active in that stretch of land stiffened up and turned sluggish. They were converted into marionettes one after another. With their help, Klein constantly moved, without causing a stir. Soon, he arrived at the south bank of the Tussock River, and after catching up to Connors Kilgore, he maintained a distance of 1 kilometer. To a Bizarro sorcerer, even if a marionette were to go beyond his range of control, it wouldn't immediately escape from its controlled state or die immediately. Without a Bizarro sorcerer's consciousness as a catalyst, this process was rather slow and needed nearly 10 minutes. Therefore, Klein wasn't worried that he would lose Enony, who was lying in bed, while he did his tailing. As long as he returned within 10 minutes, he could continue controlling his marionette. Silently, Klein followed Connors Kilgore as they went upstream. Passing through the dense forest, they climbed up a mountain beside the bank. At this moment, Connors Kilgore, who wasn't wearing a vest or coat, suddenly stopped. He checked his surroundings and widened the range of his search as though he was trying to claim his territory. Upon seeing this, Klein didn't dare stay any longer. He immediately switched places with his marionettes and retreated repeatedly, pulling away to a distance of nearly 3 kilometers from the deputy director of Mi-9. At this moment, he gave up control of the marionettes ahead of him. The death of a few bugs wouldn't incur any suspicion. This was all too common in the outskirts and in the forests. King of the Five Seas Nast can create a fighting environment that's favorable for him. Will Connors Kilgore, who's also a Black Emperor pathway demigod, have the ability to demarcate such a region? He can change, boost, and use certain rules and make whoever tails him expose themselves without being able to hide. It's very possible. Klein warily took out a gold coin he placed in his pajama pocket. He ran it through his fingers and flipped it. This time, he deliberately controlled his strength and didn't produce a flicking sound. The gold coin flew up in silence and landed in his palm. Without needing to look down, the gold coin's face was naturally reflected in his mind. It was heads. This meant that the anomaly ahead contained extreme danger. As expected of a demigod. Such abilities sure are enviable. However, do you think you can avoid my tailing? Klein scoffed inwardly and found an abnormally secluded spot and made himself turn into Gehrman Sparrow. Following that, he clasped his hands and pressed it to his mouth, whispering, "Blessed of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rorstad archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Carvatur." After praying, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the grey fog. He sat at the fool's seat and beckoned for the bone scepter with blue gems embedded at its tip. Then, with the help of his prayer, he utilized the sea god scepters responding to believers and saw the area around Gehrman Sparrow. He then raised his field of view and took in the surrounding area. Using this as the origin, he expanded his vision to 5 nautical miles. This was the limit of what the sea god scepter could observe with the help of its believers. And this way, the area where Connors Klein had designated, one that no object could escape his notice, appeared in Klein's vision. In the dock area, inside a warehouse with plenty of goods. Love. After Trissy chuckled, her figure grew faint as though she was bathed in the luster of a lake at night. In the blink of an eye, Trissy, who had been bound tightly with layers of silk by Demoness of Unaging Katerina Pell, turned into an illusory mirror. It was a full-body mirror taller than a person. Aqueous light shimmered within as a ghostly halo grew out of it as though it was a door leading to another world. At that moment, it didn't reflect the scene in front of it. Instead, it outlined a room. The room was dimly lit. The bed and furniture had been diced up into countless small pieces which were scattered everywhere. Only the central region was spick and span. Trissy stood there, wearing a dark black dress. Her hair cascaded down smoothly as it fluttered in the wind, accentuating her face's abnormal fairness. She looked like a female ghost as spoken in folk tales. She wasn't actually present and was using the illusory mirror to project her figure and strength remotely. It was as though everything was real. Therefore, she wasn't flustered at all when she was being controlled and hunted. Upon seeing this scene, Katerina Pell, who wore simple and holy white robes, didn't hesitate to let out a shriek. Invisible waves quickly spread out as her hair flared up, each strand clear and distinct. They were thick and dyed with a grayish-white color. The illusory full-body mirror suddenly vibrated and shook as though it was on the brink of breaking apart. And in the messy room it reflected, the fragments of the bed, desk, and chairs turned grayish-white, losing their luster as though they were rocks. The brownish-yellow floor in front of Trissy turned into grayish-white rocks as it quickly extended towards the only human in the room like a surging tidal wave. Trissy didn't attempt to resist as she turned around and waved her hand back while leaping towards the open window. In midair, invisible spider webs that belonged to her phased into existence. They turned dark as they spread towards the grayish-white colors. At the same time, the dark and profound full-body mirror produced one crack after another. Amidst illusory shattering sounds, it broke apart and vanished. However, before the full-body mirror completely vanished, the grayish-white colors receded in a strange manner inside the petrified room, materializing into a figure. The figure wore a simple, holy white robe and had luscious raven black hair. She looked both mature and innocent, as though she had a pair of profound and childlike blue eyes. She was Demoness of Unaging Katerina who had just been inside the warehouse a moment ago. Viscount Stratford could no longer see the situation inside the opposite room once the ghostly glow dissipated. He retracted his gaze and cast it onto Charmaine. He wore a mixed look in his eyes before he recovered. Trissy really was patient. To deal with me, she actually spent months to nurture a new demoness. Viscount Stratford shook his head with a chuckle. What did she want you to gain from me? At that moment, with Trissy's connection being severed, the spider webs around Charmaine had loosened. They were unable to bind her and restrict her freedom. This beautiful girl wore a blank expression as she replied with a vacant look in her eyes. She wanted me to know who you are truly loyal to. Without waiting for Viscount Stratford to say a word, she asked hesitantly, her eyes making it obvious that she had difficulty finding the words, how many of those promises that you made to me were real? Viscount Stratford was taken aback before he chuckled. You're probably the most silly and most naive demoness I've ever met. Charmaine's expression froze on her face as the glimmer in her eyes that she found so hard to regain faded bit by bit. Outside the warehouse, Zio and Fours were hiding in the shadows, observing the silent target area. They had followed Viscount Stratford here. Their patience had paid off, as they discovered this captain of the Royal Guards secretly leaving his mansion in the dead of the night, rushing to the dock area near the Backland Bridge. Using Zio's power as a sheriff, they followed him all the way here by keeping a huge distance between them. They had also confirmed that he had entered the warehouse in front of them. In addition, they also sensed that Viscount Stratford's condition had worsened as though he had been injured. Actually, we had the opportunity to take action while on our way here. Fours looked at the warehouse's entrance and murmured. Zio replied without looking at her, but you said it yourself that you have a nagging feeling that things aren't that simple and wanted to wait. This might be the intuition of an astrologer. It might also be an act of procrastination. Fours replied in a self-deprecating manner. They didn't say anything more as silence ruled once more. They continued waiting patiently. At this moment, a pitch-black flame was ignited on the rammed earth in front of them. The strange flames rapidly dispersed and kept close to the ground as it swept away. It then outlined a row of Loanese text, "This is the chance you've been longing for." Zio's and Force's pupils dilated at the same time. Then, they looked at each other, at a loss for words. After a few seconds, Force finally couldn't help but ask, "What do we do?"